We're back. The boys are back. We're gonna do another one. We're doing another one. I'm fulfilling the obligation. Okay, I don't know how many more. Is it seven after this?
Oh, well, that was before Worlds when you had two more incidences of the F-bomb Eric Helms. So you're
God,
you're essentially just locked in for the better part of your life to now doing sports science
you
episodes.
you are not gonna believe the clothing line I'm dropping later on this summer. We're, we're gonna have to re-up on this negotiate. I better drop it before and get a good lawyer and a good contract. Because yeah,
The
but
FEH brand, it's coming out. Yeah. Feh.
full brand,
We're gonna
listen.
rock the feh.
You'd be surprised. SBD signing on for a signature series on their singlets. It's fucking wild. I can't believe I talked Benjamin Banks into this, but in a moment of non-sobriety, we had a chat and he's all on board. Numbers don't lie. Numbers don't lie, Eric. We'll cut you in, buddy. We'll talk.
I
Listen,
love it.
we don't have, it's tacky to do it online. Let's take it offline and we'll continue. But
Sounds
anyway,
good.
so the series is healthy, as are you gentlemen, and topic that never gets old, weight cutting.
Yeah.
And we see it in every single freaking sport. The the science itself has evolved, the way we approach it has evolved. I've been around for a hot minute. I've heard 101 stories within powerlifting. We have seen, I remember Pana talking about stories and has pictures of him going to the hospital, to the emergency room, bad weight cutting. You've seen people, other powerlifters have been on the podcast or just posted how weight cuts have gone awry and gone sideways on them. And you've had other powerlifters come on here and say, I could drop 7 kilos and smash come the day of 2 hour weigh in. It's absolutely incredible. We've had people like Jessica Bittner do incredible hero cuts, turn around and win world championships. So it's all over the place. There is definitely a science to it this day and age, but now science is readily available. You got podcasts like this with gentlemen with PhDs like yourselves, but back in the day, we didn't. And there are some horrific stories. You don't know where you're going if you don't look back. So we should take a look back, talk about some of the stories, talking about how sports science has evolved with weight cutting. And more to that point, I know everybody knows you gentlemen are. It's not your first go around, but let's also talk about your backgrounds in this particular topic. Um, Eric, maybe you could say a little something about Kedric because our friend is a stitch shy when it comes to talking about his own accolades.
Yeah, no, and I can understand because they're many, they're manifold, the accolades if you look at who he's working with and where the sport has gone. But yeah, I think this all starts back for me when I first started competing in powerlifting myself in 2006, I think was my very first meet. And, back then I wasn't even done with my bachelor's degree. But if we fast forward a couple years, I started powerlifting coaching in 2010-ish. One of my very first clients, a little old, guy named Bryce Lewis, competing in an era where you could compete raw, but you would be in actual equipped meets along with everyone else. We were competing in federations in California where they had a 24-hour weigh-in. And that is a completely different animal to what we see today. And, I actually came out here to New Zealand where Kedric and I are a few years after that, where I started to transition from being just purely a coach to wanting to bring essentially a level of professionalism in the sports science model to powerlifting and bodybuilding, which are, my iron game loves. So what I saw in this era was like cycling, combat sports, other sports are getting sports scientists and sports nutritionists, and it's elevating the whole game. And you're seeing new levels of performance across any sport code where sports science get embedded. And I said, we can do this. And today we're there. Your typical high level lifter that you see getting a Sheffield invite, standing on the podium at Worlds, or getting an SBD sponsorship, is they've got they've got a meet day coach, they've got a programming coach, they have a sports nutritionist. They might be using a velocity tracker on their bar. They're using RPE, which is something that has now been scientifically validated and tested from Mike T initially creating it. That's what I actually did my PhD on, and I did my master's looking at another form of weight cutting and protein manipulation, kind of long-term fat loss. So today we see essentially a pit crew around each one of these athletes like they're a high performance, Formula One car. You've got multiple metrics, objective, subjective, scientifically validated. You have sports dietitians, sports physiotherapists, strength and conditioning coaches, or essentially powerlifting coaches, all heavily informed by research. And you see a ton of people with master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, and PhDs in nutrition and exercise science if you were to go to IPF Worlds. But it was not always this way, Ryan, not by any means. And unfortunately, to some pretty like grave consequences. And we'll talk about the history of kind of weight cutting broadly, and I'll let Kedric take the mic. But like you said, he doesn't want to sing his own praises. But Kedric first reached out to me because after I finished my PhD, I essentially was trying to create a a space where more sports science could be done for strength and physique sport. And that is now what we do. And we are heavily invested in powerlifting at AUT at the Sports Performance Research Institute in New Zealand. And I have, just to give people an idea, Alyssa Joy Spence. She is a national champion here in New Zealand from Canada. She did her PhD on stretching and powerlifters. We have Kedric Kwan, who just submitted his PhD. So everyone give him a round of applause. He's nearly there as far as actually being Dr. Kedric Kwan. He's going to defend his PhD later this year. And concurrently, and this is really hard to do, over the last 5 years through COVID and working on his PhD, he has also built a name for himself as the foremost authority on weight cutting in modern powerlifting. And he first reached out to me to come do his PhD here, and there's others currently doing it. He started Reformance, which is now a household name. Andrew King, Alyssa Joy Spence, both of them are. Andrew also just submitted his PhD here at AUT. He's a powerlifting coach for Reformance, and he is specifically doing his PhD on the role of carbohydrate for fueling powerlifting performance. And Alyssa, like I said, did it on stretching. They're both coaches. So we're seeing the embedding of sports science in powerlifting. And we've got a good chunk of them all here in Auckland, New Zealand, which is a huge joy for me. Big also shout out to Christian Amdi. He's on the Danish powerlifting national team as a coach, and he is specifically looking at transfer and specificity. And he's got about a year left in his PhD, and he's looking at pin squat and other variations. So there's a ton of research being done here. And Kedric kind of was one of the few who started that process. We went to Calgary, 2018, IPF Worlds, and I introduced him to the top lifters and some of the top coaches. I was there coaching at the time, and he did a survey where he was humbly asking some of the top level lifters about what did they do for their weight cutting process. And then if we fast forward 7 years later, there are lifters humbly asking him if they can help him with their weight cutting to a degree that he can't even take them all on. Because he's working with something ridiculous like a third to maybe 40% of the current, world champions. If you look at the list of people who compete at the Sheffield, the top elite of the top lifters, if there's one coach who is working with the majority or one coaching team of the majority for nutrition, but not just nutrition, he's also coaching many of them, it's Reformance and Kedric Kwan. And there's a reason for that. And it's not me just saying that Kedric is awesome, but he is. It's because of the importance of taking an evidence-based approach in a closed sport like powerlifting. There's one input, and there's one output, and a lot of the things we're looking at. There's training, nutrition, there's weight, and there's load on the bar, and there's body weight. This is not a complicated sport. And when you can control the variables, you can really start to optimize performance. Of course, it's still people. And you need to have, the art of coaching down just like the science. But we are at an era now where If you can figure out how to optimize your body composition, your strength to weight ratio, and then get as lean as you can without getting too lean so it's not sustainable, which is a delicate balance that we've talked about on this podcast, and there's notable examples. And then you can get within striking distance of being the next weight class down, and you can do an intelligent, acute, rapid weight loss cutting phase that doesn't tank your performance. All of a sudden, we can see a world record jump by, oh, I don't know, 70 kilos, Ryan, like we recently saw with Shell, dropping
Mm.
down from, his weight class into the next.
And who
Or
helped you?
Evie. Oh, that's a good question. Who helped Shell? Kedric?
Who coached him?
Uh, I guess me. Like,
That's right.
God, is he a
Or
cutie
sometimes
patootie or what? How adorable is this guy?
he's
Sorry.
adorable. And if there's a lot of coaches out there, Ryan, and I'll tell you this, who they have one or two world champions, and they kind of ride those coattails into infamy, and they don't have a whole lot of other athletes that they can say they've worked with. Um, but there are so many who have followed suit and worked with Kedrick. Evie Corrigan is another notable one who was the plucky, ranked 12 out of 12 for the inaugural Sheffield and won the whole damn thing because she dropped into the 52s and again knocked that world record like 30 kilos down the field or more. I don't even remember what it was at the time. And these are just many, many examples of it's not like a new concept, dropping down to a weight class, retaining your total, and then doing it better. But if you don't actually know how to do that efficiently, then it's not on the table. And while lifters have never needed science to be top level, it enables us to get a better idea of the mechanisms of how things work, to target the things that really matter, and to let go of some of the practices that are sufficient to get you there, but not optimal. Anecdotal evidence is still evidence. It's great. But if you look at what world champions and top level lifters do, we don't know what really was all necessary into contributing to their success. And when we're talking about nutrition, Ryan, a lot of it is fluff, and some of it is harmful fluff. If we believe that we have to pray to the sun god Ra for the sun to come up every morning, and damn it, I prayed
Sorry.
and the sun came up. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. I'm glad the sun is here. And it's like, well, I haven't not ever prayed to the sun god, and the sun has come up every time. I'm not going to stop. But once we can actually get
Mm.
beyond the anecdotes and we can see what actually causes what is a correlation, what's causation, what's necessary, or what's something that is making your job a little harder, we can stop, you know, rolling down the window and getting into our car and going, oh, I can open the car door and get in. Because as much as I love me some good anecdotes and we ask, top level lifters, what do you do? All we know is that everything a top level lifter did somehow contributed to their success, or truly, it didn't prevent their success. That's all we know. That whatever they were doing was not sufficient to prevent them from being a top level lifter. But a lot of it is window dressing, and some of it takes away from their performance just a little bit. And once we have embraced a lot of these uh, better strategies, this is the scientific method of finding out what does what and which levers to pull, which things work which way, we've seen this stratospheric increase in performance that is in part, and I will 100% admit it, because I'm obviously science biased, due to just an increased participation level. But it is not a, I think it's very unlikely, I'll put my scientist hat on when I say this, that so many top level lifters are embracing these methods and seeming to be at the highest level. You can't just get by on genetics anymore because of the participation level. So these two things are synergistic. When you have so many people with the talent to be at a high level, what is going to separate people is their effort, their consistency, and then the approach they take and the methods. So, anyway, I just wanted to give a bit of that background and point out how where we are today is part of the professionalization of powerlifting. And it's really cool to see how much powerlifters have embraced science, especially at the highest level. And I think it's really important for us to talk about it because what lifters do at the highest level is not necessarily what lifters should do at, say, the regional level or, at the novice level.
Cedric, That's quite the intro for you,
Yeah,
sir. And the
yeah,
topic.
quite a
My man is well spoken. He raises a high bar.
yeah. Thanks, Eric, for the intro and uh, the extra flattery. And yeah, I think coming from 2018 back in the day, right? Uh, where we are now, that definitely has been some improvement in the field. Uh, I would say that things have changed. If I can't speak for anyone else, I speak for myself because my views back in 2018 to now is also a little bit different and it's also evolving, right? So there are certain things I maybe we could probably talk about it later down the segment, but that I've kind of fine-tuned my thinking around. But I do think that in order to first kind of like see um, why rapid weight cutting is uh, has such a high emphasis, we kind of have to like trace back the origin of this kind of like practice. And one thing I would probably say right now is that there are actually a lot of experts out there on weight cutting, but they tend to focus on combat sports, right? Powerlifting is still uh, a, a relatively growing sport, which means that there are not as many eyes on powerlifting. Not to mention, you don't have like power doing weigh-ins. You don't have like you know the eight lifters standing in a circle staring down each other for the press to take pictures of. Like they have in UFC. So of course that doesn't catch as much of an attention. And the weight cuts, at least in the IPF now, which is the biggest powerlifting federation, at least under one umbrella, right? Uh, they do 2 hour weigh-ins, which isn't as sort of like uh, glamorous because you don't cut as large of an amount compared to like UFC where they have like a 24-hour weigh-in, right? 24-hour weigh-in simply means the time you compete would be 24 hours after you weigh in. So that is whereas in the IPF is 2 hours. So with the time being much shorter, the ability to sort of like rehydrate and replenish what you lost is narrower, which means that you probably wouldn't be able to cut as much, all things being equal, without some form of drop in performance. But the reason why I mentioned combat sports is because a lot of this practice from weight cutting actually goes back to combat sports. And the big one is actually wrestling, right? So I think wrestling is actually one of the older sport that has continuity up to the modern day, right? From ancient times, which is Greek wrestling, right? Back in the Olympics, and I back in the day they actually don't have weight classes, right? There's no standardized weight classes, but I do think that uh, they do kind of like price a typical like look, like all the Greek statues they look a certain way for some reason because that's kind of like what the athletic look would be, and there are certain ways that people kind of like manipulate what they consume to look a certain way. Like I think in bodybuilding, right? Back in the day, at least, people think about, oh, you need to dry out, right? So you need to not look so soft, and therefore you need to cut water after X amount of time. That practice is actually uh, that aesthetic look that certain like wrestlers back in the day want to achieve was also present back then. So they use like some form of manipulation of like water, or maybe just like not eating so much before uh they wrestle, so they don't look like bloated with food, right? So that's kind of like how some form of like manipulation of food and fluid actually took place back in the day, even though they don't have weight classes, right? And on the flip side, you also have sumo wrestling, which is the complete opposite, which they use food to manipulate how big they can grow. So they just want to grow as huge as they can, right? So one end of the spectrum right there. So this practice is not new to people in the 21st century, right? But it's definitely more systematized right now. And because of how it's systematized, we can actually kind of like use science, right? Which is a tool, right? To figure out some form of like probable causation, right? And improve the method because it's now more systematized. Whereas back in the day, like you don't really know if the weight cutting would actually help this person that's fighting. For back in the Greek day, this guy won because he's not a slave. Because obviously the slave will probably have less nutrition leading up to the competition, and before they throw them in the Colosseum and get them to kill each other. So I think that now that things are more systematized, we can attribute certain causative links towards it. And I think if we kind of like, make a big time leap into roughly the 20th century, right? So, a good like 1,300 years later, and you look at wrestling in the US. I mean, there's also wrestling in Russia and stuff, but back in the day, because of reasons, the Russian files are always like secretly sealed, right? That there was this one point where suddenly the Russian secret training text came out, and like the whole world was like going crazy over that. Back when we started like the strength conditioning or sports science research for strength training, like Russian periodizations, like this secret manual, right? That got all these Russian people really strong, but they didn't include their pharmaceutical protocol. But because Russian wrestling is actually a thing as well, right? But for reasons there isn't access to the information, a lot of it focused in the States, and wrestling was also really big, right? Especially in the States. For people who are not familiar, like collegiate sports is huge, so like you can basically make a living, have a career if you do well in collegiate sports. So they have like the NCAAs. And what happens, the thing with the NCAAs as well, is that because they're in college, they tend to be a little bit younger, right? And I think that there's a certain like psychological profile of like college age men, right? Or college age young men that like to do extremely risky stuff, right? Probably due to certain brain development that, they're not as mature. So it'd be like, oh yeah, I have to do like crazy stuff. Or sometimes it's not even that crazy. It's like cool, instead of focusing on my wrestling match, and tightening up my nutrition well, leading into my wrestling meet, I just like leave it last minute and I have to cut a whole bunch of weight. So there have been certain like death in college wrestling in the NCAAs. I think this happened in the late like around 1997, 1995, right? The big scandal was that 3 college wrestlers died within like I think less than 2 months due to complications from severe dehydration. And then because of that, the association started to look into it and see what they can do to kind of like prevent that, and more research was being put into that area to ensure that the risk is like mitigated, right? Like I say, it's not surprising that the incidences happen all within this like time frame, right? Within this like very subpopulation, and I think that also parallels quite well towards like powerlifting, because every young lifter will probably think that they need to cut weight, so it's not like this is being invented by powerlifters. But when we look at how this kind of like progress over time, more science started to take hold when it comes to understanding the processes, and with that, the weigh-in periods became shorter. So instead of allowing people to weigh in over, rehydrate over a 24-hour period, they just narrowed that window, and they found that was probably one of the ways that actually prevent crazy cuts, right? And that was kind of like I actually don't really know how that was the rule for powerlifting. I don't know, Eric, whether you have insight, but I know weightlifting does that as well, right? So 2-hour weigh-in for weightlifting. And for me, I just assumed that powerlifting just kind of like adopted that framework as well. So with that 2-hour weigh-in, the window became narrower. And because the window is narrower, right, your opportunities for mistakes are kind of like, your margin of error is smaller, right? Because you only have 2 hours. And if you mess things up, you could probably like mess up your entire meet. We've heard stories of people just feeling really weak after they cut too much, or even some where people overemphasize eating or drinking certain stuff and they just feel so bloated that they start throwing up, right? Because the thing with a 24-hour weigh-in is that if you eat a whole bunch of food, you are likely to be able to digest that. Your body should be able to absorb that. But when you within a 2 hour time frame, there's like a rate limiting sort of like a threshold where your amount of fluids and food that your body can absorb or digest within a certain period. Therefore, all this became like really, really uh sort of like more specific, and people tend to focus on it a little bit more now just because the margin of error is actually very, very small. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like a brief like outline on a transition to the modern time, why there's a little bit more emphasis on it now, right? Why people think that weight cutting is actually uh, something that they should pay attention to compared to before, where people just like, oh yeah, I cut weight, and then I just do whatever I want, right? I drink a whole bottle of soy sauce or stuff like that. Or in South Africa back in the day, a lifter consumed so much salt that he like things exited both his holes from the top and the bottom when he was squatting, right? Because of
Whoa, whoa, whoa.
certain complications. So
Really? When was
yeah,
what worlds was this?
in the 74 kilo weight class in South Africa.
This is Taylor Atwood. Is that what you're saying?
Nah,
This is
nah,
Taylor Atwood.
it's not Taylor Atwood. Nah.
Third attempt, world record attempt. I'm gonna look this up. Thank you. Thank you.
I think there's a really interesting lesson here because there have been many attempts by sporting organizations to promote, hey, athletes and honestly, coaches and athlete and sport culture, we need to consider health. And everyone goes, sweet, sounds good, whether we're talking about, drug testing or whether we're talking about weigh-ins. But ultimately, the only way these changes have really been made is when you mess with athletes' performance. And some people it might not be intuitive when you think about it that going from a 24 to a 2 hour weigh-in would actually make weigh-ins safer. 'Cause you're thinking, oh my God, then they're going to try to cut even more weight in a shorter period. But you're forgetting what is the primary incentive structure of sport. It's performance. And if you have to compete in 2 hours, you are now controlling two factors. Like it's not just the making weight, it's rehydrating and being able to perform. And I think that's what was a really intelligent change to the environment, which kind of forced safety by messing with athletes' performance. That changed the safety of collegiate wrestling in the States, and it had knock-on effects. For those who don't know, the International Weightlifting Federation also has a 2 hour weigh-in period. So the IWF has had that for a long time. I don't actually know when the IWF or the IPF started, but I want to say that it has been a long-standing thing, potentially as long or shortly after uh, the same period in wrestling. So it's difficult to find like IPF technical rule books or IWF technical rule books before 2006, 2009. But even then, they had been using 2 hour rules, 2 hour weigh-in periods. And I would say the interesting thing is that it is very sport specific as to how the weigh-in period impacts performance. Ryan, you'll love this. There's been a lot of consistent research been done on not just how much weight do you lose, but how much do you put on after you make weight and the impact on performance. I'll ask you this. Boxers, wrestlers, which one do you think is impacted more by putting weight back on?
Wrestlers.
Absolutely. So when you see data on boxers, it's inconsistent as to whether or not there is a prediction of their competitive success with how well they rehydrate and how much weight they put back on because it's a striking sport, right? You don't get to shoot in on somebody and weigh more than them. And sometimes in these combat sports where we're talking about a 24-hour period, you can have someone cutting what we would describe as like two weight classes, right? So imagine if you're the wrestler or the mixed martial artist who kind of just walks around close to your weight and you're like, yeah, I'm an 83, and you're competing against another quote unquote 83, but the dude's a 105, and that's
Oh,
the kind of weight
Jesus.
cuts. Yeah, you're gonna get thrown around like a rag doll.
Yeah,
But
that's
eh,
horrible.
absolutely. Now, certainly someone who's, 100 kilos versus 80 kilos is probably going to punch harder as well. But when we're talking about actually physically wrestling, it's there's a much larger performance potential impact. So the same thing is true of other sports. Dehydration does not uniformly affect physical performance. Dehydration is going to have a larger impact on like anaerobic and aerobic performance at a lower percentage loss of body weight than it does on strength. And it also can be recovered on a different time course because of just the physiology of those performances. So while we borrow some of these practices, both institutionally and scientifically, from combat sport, not all of them fit. And you will see that there are slightly different amounts, even when you compare, 2-hour weigh-in periods in combat athletes in different codes, like boxers versus wrestlers, to say weightlifters or powerlifters. And it's difficult to interpret whether that is purely because of the effect on performance or some of these like cultural norms. Because Kedric said, okay, we're talking about the cultural norms of being a young male collegiate lifter. Some of this stuff is just kind of embedded. Like when you look at qualitative interviews of combat sport athletes, they identify with the weight cut on a pretty deep level. Like that is them displaying their discipline, their hardcoreness, and not doing a weight cut almost makes them feel like something is wrong. Like this is like no. This is how I get in the zone. Is I put myself through hell, and you got to sit in the sauna. And old school coaches, they will kind of maintain some of these methods that aren't always ideal, but because they have this cultural significance and attachment. So I think it's probably a good thing that we are seeing at an early stage, like Kedrick described. Powerlifting is a young sport. It doesn't have the kind of eyeballs on it that some of these other sports we've talked about do, is adopting some of these more evidence-based methods and can kind of borrow from some of the more dangerous eras in combat sport because we don't truly have some of these kind of like voodoo, like chicken blood kind of practices that are embedded into combat sport because combat sport comes out of martial arts, and martial arts has thousands of years of history and cultural attachment to it and belief systems. And you can just go on YouTube and you can see like you know fake martial artist gets taken down by a UFC guy, and there's this kind of fight between like the art or kind of the mysticism that is embedded in some traditions of martial arts and the more scientific or kind of real combat. Does this work kind of in the real world stuff, like the self-defense classes where the person like karate chops the rubber handgun and then does this complicated move, and you're like, this is how you stop an attacker with a gun. They're like, no, whatever, dude. Give him your wallet, and then if you get a chance, kick him in the nuts and run, kind of deal. So there are these cultural disconnects that are a barrier to progress in combat sports that I just don't think were as well established in powerlifting, which is a good thing because we're able to see this big change in just a span of 6 years in the way that people approach this. But there's still a lot more work to be done, which I think is worth talking about.
Remember, even just gut cutting has been
Hmm.
relatively new. Counting macros. I remember when that first came in, water cuts, etc. But people don't do them right. The gut cut has been relatively new, but water cutting is still a little bit all over the place in terms of the proper ways to do it, sodium manipulation, water manipulation leading up to, etc. Where do you guys want to go with this? What do you think is the next step?
Actually, can I make one little comment here? I've been very science forward, but I want to acknowledge that a lot of the times because of I'm going to say it, the capitalistic nature of sport, where the bottom line is not profits, it's performance. You will often get coaches who are good at observing, taking notes, and are very much not attached to tradition. They're attached to let's do what works,
Mm,
and who take the scientific method as an approach, and athletes who are also open-minded, willing to try things experimental, innovative, but also intelligent and can connect cause and effect through observation. Sometimes athletes are ahead of the science. So the first study on water loading, Ryan, it only happened in the last 10 years or so. And there's a great researcher, Dr. Reed Reel, who is actually now working with UFC as a performance scientist. And I've had the pleasure of, doing presentations with him and talking to him. And he's well cited if you look at any of the weight cutting research in strength sport now. He did the first study on water loading, and it wasn't in a protocol he invented. Water loading is something that I've been aware of since almost the beginning of my career that athletes were doing. This must have happened just pure from observation. You know, when I just cut water, I don't lose quite as much weight in the same time frame as when I load water and then cut it. And the physiological rationale had never been tested. I mean, it makes sense. If I increase urinary output by ramping up my water, because water balance is tightly regulated, or we wouldn't be alive, right? So the whole idea is the higher your fluid intake, the more quickly your urinary output keeps you at the right level of hydration. But there is some lag time to this, maybe 24 hours, 12 hours, who knows, right? So, what lifters began doing was exactly what we know. They load water, then the day before their weigh-ins, they cut it down drastically, and they observe that they're able to lose more weight than if they had just cut the water on its own. Because then you don't have the high turnover, you just have your body reducing its urinary output to try to prevent you from getting too dehydrated, right? So Reed Reel, for his doctoral work, he specifically did research on this and found exactly that. Like athletes lose about 0.5% more of their body weight, if I recall the data correctly, on average, from doing water loading versus just pure water cutting. And so I think that's pretty interesting. Sometimes science serves to validate what athletes are already doing. Not in all cases, and like you said, there's a
Mm.
huge amount of heterogeneity. Like it's easy sometimes to also cherry pick and be like, these coaches and athletes were ahead of the game. But like you said, some people are doing it right and some people are doing it way
Mm.
wrong and to their own detriment or danger. But I think that's pretty cool too, is that a lot of the times what we can do is we can look at practice, and this is why good sports science, it involves surveys, it involves interviews, then what we do is we generate a protocol. We report that data. We do sports science podcasts. Athletes go out in the world, do it. Practice changes. It comes back to us, and then we look at the new practice. So it's almost this kind of reciprocal relationship where we learn from what athletes are doing, we refine it, and then we give it back to them. Because a good scientist, in my opinion, a good sports scientist, a good coach, they will listen to some of these anecdotes and they will acknowledge the observation, but they won't necessarily buy into the mechanistic explanation, right?
Mm.
So here's a great example, an old school one. Like bodybuilders have said forever in back in the day, like, oh, during contest prep, I do high reps because high reps cuts up the muscle and adds those striations. Um, and I will sit here and go, all right, I recognize that you guys are doing high reps in contest prep and you are noticing that you're getting leaner faster. But I do not think that just because you contracted your arm more times that it is actually changing the morphological structure of the striations in your muscle. I reject the likelihood of that. But what's going on? Now, 10, 15 years later, we see that energy expenditure and exercise is almost directly related to volume load or tonnage, sets times reps times load. And if you think about it, if you do your 20 rep max, that's like 60% of 1 RM, right? Let's say your 1 RM is 100 kilos. 20 times 60 is more than 10 times 80, right? So you're going to burn more calories in a given workout. If you're still training to failure or close to it like bodybuilders do, you're still doing similar exercises, but you end up shifting all your rep ranges up. And, everything makes a difference when you're trying to get as lean as bodybuilders do. So there maybe the reason why they're doing such high reps is they're noticing that they're able to get leaner faster. And especially considering now we also have data showing, at least not for strength, but for hypertrophy, you can work in high rep ranges, moderate rep ranges, or moderately low rep ranges. And on a set to set basis, it provides a similar stimulus for muscle growth. Now it starts to make sense. So you buy into the observation. And our job as sports scientists is not to poo poo these observations of athletes or coaches in the trenches, but maybe not buy into them kind of just around the water cooler going, yeah, probably, I don't know, cuts up the muscle or whatever like that. Like you'll often hear correct observations, incorrect explanations, and that's where I think science is really useful to step in.
It goes right back to what you said about the sun rose. I prayed last night. Maybe that's why the sun rose. Well, You observed the sun rose. You filled in what you thought the other way. Quick question. I'm not going to divert us, I promise. But I remember seeing something about as long as you're training to either a max set, top range type deal, it didn't matter the rep ranges to build muscle mass. Is that true if it's you're doing triples? You could build as much muscle mass as if you're doing sets of eight.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of context around there, and this is where it's pretty cool because we can start experimentally testing this in a way that is not like it's very rare to just change one variable in a training plan in the real world. So, for example, typically high frequency programs are also high volume programs when you kind of look at what happens in the real world. So it's difficult for us to tease the difference out between volume and frequency, as an example. Typically, people who are training all the way to failure, you're kind of hit enthusiasts. If we kind of look at the bodybuilding traditional approach, they're also doing really low volume. So we don't know the independent effect of training to failure without doing so in a low volume context. But in research, what we can do is we can go, all right, we're going to do the same total number of sets, but we're going to manipulate load and reps. Or we'll do the same tonnage, but you're going to do more sets of triples and I'm going to do less sets of eight to get there. And now we have enough studies to look at this, Ryan, where we see that any rep range can build muscle. But when you're doing really low reps and high loads, while you're immediately recruiting every motor unit there because you have to meet the force demands of this heavy lift, which means all the muscle fibers are being stimulated, if the set only lasts 10 seconds, it's not enough to actually stimulate all of them to grow. So you might need to do something like four sets of three to be equivalent to something like, three sets of 10. So when we look at kind of where is that floor and where is the ceiling, I'll tell you about the high reps as well, because there's an issue with trying to do sets of 50 and 60. Somewhere around 4 to 6 reps per set. If you're doing heavy sets of five, that is kind of where you stop seeing a decrement in the number of reps you have to do. So there's a great study by Schoenfeld, there's another one by Weiss, and there's another one by Mangine. And these three studies kind of compare like your more kind of power building rep range and your more kind of traditional moderate rep range. And when you do the same number of sets, there are more studies than not that indicate, hey, once you're getting below like five-ish reps, if you're reasonably close to failure, if it's a hard set, you don't need to be doing a 5 RM by any means. That's where that set, all those reps, quote unquote, counted, but there weren't enough of them to put it on equal footing to another set of higher reps. So this is why it's sometimes more useful if you're trying to be in a muscle building phase for a power lifter to do higher rep work. And then you're thinking, okay, well, if I want to do sets at eight, do I have to do it on a squat? That's hard, like, well, not really. We're not trying to get direct transfer 24 weeks out and we're working on quad size. Maybe we could do a safety bar squat. Hell, maybe we could do a belt squat, something that is less taxing but can still get that stimulus. And then on the really, really high end of it, you could say, hey, I need a break from load. I've got a bum knee and it seems like my hip pisses me off and it's load dependent. If I'm only working with 60% of 1RM, man, isn't that terrible? Because it won't transfer to strength. Well, if your goal is hypertrophy, you can do 20 or 30 reps so long as you're actually pretty close to failure, and it'll be a similar stimulus to a set of eight. But there is a
Really?
point. Yes,
Mm.
yes. The problem is, in a lab setting, you have a whole room full of grad students, research assistants, people like me, screaming at you, go, 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 pushing you to failure. You don't have that when you're training on your own. You might have your crew with you, you might have your boy, but perception of proximity to failure is heavily influenced by your overall fatigue, discomfort, and just how much you feel crappy and like you're going to puke in a bucket when you're doing high rep work. So, people's accuracy for predicting basically their RPE is really good when they're doing 12 reps and lower, and especially on squat and bench press and these multi joint movements. But it gets precipitously worse the higher reps you start to go. And you also see that if you compare like bench presses, leg presses, lat pull downs, multi joint movements, when you're doing 20 to 30 reps to failure versus 8 to 12, people rate their perceived exertion for the whole session higher. They rate discomfort higher, and they have what's called a negative affect compared to a positive affect, which is just like a scientific vibe check. Like on a scale
Mm.
of -5 to 5, Negative numbers representing that. I didn't like that. I have a negative feeling associated with that, positive being a positive feeling. When you do sets of 8 to 12 to failure with trained lifters, they're rating it in the ones and twos. Like, oh, that was a good hard workout, but I liked it. I got good vibes. And when it's sets at 20 to 30, they're like -2, -3. So
Shit.
yeah, a persistent thing that you see is less accurate gauging of proximity to failure and just feeling trashy. So, yeah, in a lab setting where we can ensure that you're actually going to failure because we're literally pushing you there with spotters and we have velocity trackers, a 20 or a 30 rep set of squats will build just as much glute and quad mass as a set of 8. Are you actually able to persistently do that and be at that 0 to 2 RIR, repetitions in reserve, or 8 to 10 RPE? Or do you just think you are, but you're actually like a 6 to 8 RPE? So in the real world, it may not pan out as well. So generally, I recommend people train in kind of like that 5 to 20 rep range, and they reserve the high rep stuff primarily for like single joint movements and accessories that aren't going to really dig you into a cardiorespiratory hole or create so much metabolic stress, especially if you're strong, where you're trying just not to throw up.
I've read before, and I mean, certain athletes have talked about it, where when you think you have nothing left, you think you have nothing left. And this is a lot like for endurance sports or sports where you're going to be pushed to the brink, like use combat sports we often do. But if it's boxing, MMA, etc., when you think there's no water left in that well, you have 30% more. You can keep going. And like marathon runners, ultra marathon runners have talked about this. Like you are so to the brink, there's nothing left. Yes, you do. You could find another gear and keep it moving. So to your point, when it's straight up, when it's strength, obviously a 1 rep max, but triple or whatever, your gravity will just win. You're going to find that far before fatigue hits you. But if you're doing sets of 60 or reps with 60 reps in there, fatigue will get you. And you'll start slowing down long before you actually get to the bottom of that well. You're telling yourself, well, this has got to be it. I'm in so much pain. I'm so fatigued. But in reality, if your life was on the line or it's not gravity, it's going to stop you. You're going to quit. You're going to give. Whereas when it's fewer reps in that set, gravity will probably jump in long before fatigue ever does, more than likely. So I could totally see that for sure. And then, so if you're going to be working within ranges that are, you're going to the gym and you honestly think you to get this growth, you're going to do that many reps. You have to dig deep like that day in, day out. More than likely, you're not going to. You're going to
Yeah.
dig deep into that well, that Muhammad Ali well of the 30%, 5 days a week. If you're working, no, you're not. You're going to dig that deep day of a competition, when you're on the running the marathon, playing the basketball game, or doing the boxing match. But day in, day out, don't set yourself up for failure by being like, I've written a program with a ridiculous amount of reps in my sets. For sure. For sure. That totally makes sense, like from a psychological aspect.
Yeah. So it's good information to know because then you can think about what are intelligent exercise, rep range, and proximity to failure pairings. And it's something that's really useful when powerlifters are hurt or when they're in phases where they're training primarily for hypertrophy. I think actually a big thing that helps powerlifters stay in the game in the modern age is we've gone through these different eras, and I know this is a diversion, but I'll be brief. We've gone through these eras of putting specificity probably too much on a pedestal, and then stepping away from it. Like I remember there was an era where people would like put their belt on during their bar warm up, and the variations on the big three were just not done. And it's one thing. It's like, we need a lot of things to be strong, and one of them is muscle size. And if ultimately we need to make our glutes and our quads bigger and our erectors bigger to have more strength on a squat, there's a lot of ways to do that that don't require you to have a low barbell position, back squat, with knee wraps on and your belt and your wrist wraps into this back position when you're 20 weeks out from your next meet. Like, get on the belt squat, because you are going to need to do a fair amount of volume at a high level, consistently, relatively close to failure. So, what is the most sustainable way to accumulate that work that's not going to beat you up? Because 12 weeks from now, you're going to need to be doing singles at 8 RPE with 90% of your 1RM. And if you have been crushing yourself with 4 sets of 10 on competition squats for the 8 weeks leading up into that, you're not going to be able to do it. So these kind of sometimes we talk about these highfalutin scientific ideas of complex periodization strategies, but really all they are is very logical, directed approaches to getting a specific adaptation that does not deplete the overall battery cell you have and puts you in a position that's quite just logistically logical. So anyway, with that aside out of the way, I think it's just really important that we think from a very applied perspective. This is translational, applied research. It's stuff that we're trying to replicate the conditions of what goes on in practice so that what we do in the lab has a high probability of being relevant to the powerlifter. And a lot of that starts with just figuring out, okay, well, what do powerlifters currently do? So one thing you were saying, Ryan, is, oh man, when you 10 years ago, powerlifters were doing all kinds of different stuff. Some were loading water, some were cutting water, some would cut water way harsher than others, some would load water aggressively over different time courses. So, Dr. Reel's research was just, hey, let's try to develop a standardized protocol for this based upon what we've seen some athletes do. Oh, lo and behold, it does work. And now people can refine that. They understand the mechanisms. He looked at certain, markers of physiology to determine what is going on, higher urinary output. Okay, we get it. We know how this works. And now we're doing research, and we actually have some stuff in peer review right now from soon to be Dr. Kwan's thesis on a gut cut. What does a very pragmatic, approach to doing a low fiber, moderate carbohydrate, essentially quote unquote low residue or high energy density, low food bulk, approach? How much weight does someone lose on average? Is it repeatable? Is it different between men and women? And those types of things help because then we put it out in the world. Then all of that heterogeneity, that variability that you see between people, it starts to narrow and you get a higher hit rate of success, lower athlete harm, and then people start refining things in a way that makes sense because we actually know which levers to pull. People are going, okay, the sun comes up, but it's not because of Ra. So what do we do and how do we use that information? Okay, maybe that can help us inform our farming practices instead of sacrificing a goat. Maybe we're going to think about the seasons and we're not being punished every year because we did a bad job and that's why winter happens. Maybe that's actually just the thing that happens every year because of our distance from the sun and our position on the planet. So that's kind of the parallel. And I think to kick things off, maybe Kedric, it'd be good. You did this survey at 2018 Worlds, and you've done subsequent surveys. Why don't you tell us what are powerlifters doing instead of just us kind of relying on the stuff we've personally seen and heard through the grapevine? When we actually do systematic approaches to surveys of top level lifters, and there's been other surveys, Nolan and colleagues, et cetera, G, of strength athletes more generally. What's going on currently in the modern landscape of weight cutting for powerlifters?
Yep. So the survey in 2018. So first of all, let me kind of like caveat it. I did that at the World Championships. So it's very isolated towards a specific population, those competing at Worlds. And I think that is important as well because if this was the only survey done, then the findings might not be applicable to people who are not competing at Worlds. But like you said, Nolan, Campbell, G, they all did studies outside of. They probably included some world class lifters as well because it's kind of like a more broad, like it's a online survey, right? Whereas mine, I did it in person. Um, and I think consistently across the board, we found that power lifters, roughly around 80, mid 85% of powerlifters do some form of weight cutting. Um, typical methods, and it's very much typical methods are actually fluid loading and fluid restriction, right? So the water cut, right? And that is also, you would say that is probably largely influenced from combat sports because if you look at this, when I did the survey in 2018, this was before kind of like Reed Reel's research was like in the conversation, So that means that people were already doing water cut before the science or the mechanism, the the mechanism has been kind of like explained to a certain extent. So you can probably infer that they got this information from like combat sports, right? So majority of them do fluid loading, fluid restriction. A lot of them typically tend to employ extended fast. So instead of, okay, cool, my last meal was at 7 p.m., right? I just like start fasting at 4 p.m. That is a very, very common one because that usually goes in tandem with water fluid restriction, right? They just restrict their water for an extended period of time, like usually 14 to 16 hours prior to weigh-ins. And gut volume manipulation, also known as now known as the gut cut, right? Is also quite frequently employed. I think back then you can see that I think that there is a slightly greater attention focus on gut cutting right now. So if you look at the surveys that are done closer towards maybe the post-COVID era, right? Because mine was done in 2018, I would say that people tend to employ gut cutting a little bit more first before they do water loading and water cutting. And the reason being is that, okay, this may be subjective, but people tend to water load slightly longer, and it might be harder for people to be like, okay, cool, I am going to be drinking an astronomical amount of water compared to what I usually do, right? So for multiple days, it's not really the most comfortable thing compared to gut cutting. Gut cutting is like, cool, I'm just going to reduce reduce the type of food that I'm reduce the volume of food that I'm eating. So technically, I'm still eating enough. Sure, I'll get hungry because, I don't eat as much vegetables and fiber. My stomach's not that filled. So I think psychologically as well, people feel that impact, right? And of course, the physiological effects of the fluid restriction and fluid cutting is that in sort of like the gut volume manipulation, you reduce the risk of any form of like dehydration or impacting your electrolyte balance, right? Because you don't mess around with the water, so your sort of like your plasma volume, your blood volume, your sodium, blood sodium's all slightly more regulated to your natural state compared to if you play around with like your water, because essentially water intake dilutes blood, it dilutes your electrolytes. So the risk of performance impact is also lower. And therefore, I think that the increase in gut cuts and actually the attention on gut cuts have actually taken a greater prominence in the recent years in powerlifting. If you ask someone, people will probably be like, "Oh yeah, sometimes you should just do a gut cut, you'll be fine, right?" Even though a lot of people try to make that claim, but I think that it's funny because first of all, if I were a betting man, I would bet that nobody has read the only proper gut cutting paper by Fu, which was done in the UK. Second, the paper that in my research that our team has done is not published yet, so there isn't that much. So people who are very like certain about, if you do a gut cutting protocol, you can lose X amount of weight, I would probably say that the numbers are not as accurate. Not to mention that it is also quite relative in the sense that it depends on how much fiber you eat, right? Because if you are reducing fiber and you are the kind that all your carbohydrates just come from sugar, the gut cut probably would reduce your volume, the weight less compared to someone who just eat fruits and vegetables all the time, right? So if someone comes up to you and said, "Hey, you're probably okay by doing a gut cut, please," like like I do think that it's a lot of conjecture there, right? But what our current research shown usually is anywhere from 1 to 1.8%, right? Even the variation is quite wide, right? And like 0.1% above your weight class means you're out of the competition. So 1.8 0.8% variation from individuals is actually quite big. But yes, I think that the gut cut has taken prominence, but the amount of someone that can lose is actually very relative to that individual. But what we have shown is, so as I mentioned, Fu done a study and their participants lost around 1% of body weight. I kind of like did a similar study, but I tweaked certain protocols. And I also repeated that the same trial within the same individual after a washout period. So a washout period is just like a reset, right? So you do this once, you reset and go back to your normal like lifestyle for like 3 to 4 weeks, and then you repeat it again, right? So essentially we're trying to replicate it to see if this effect of losing weight is just by random chance, or like and it's actually not replicable, right? But what we've shown is actually the individuals in both the same individuals across the trials actually lose a very similar amount, right? And in our study, we found losing around 1.3 to roughly 1.8, right? And we also did this in females because there's some physiological research showing like the like food passing through like the small intestines in females might be a little bit slower, right? And therefore it might not be as effective. But what we found is that essentially there is not any sex-based differences between individuals, and it is repeatable across males and females, right? So I think that when hopefully when this gets published soon, people will kind of like look into it, and then they'll be able to make certain better conclusions, right? Essentially, like, okay, cool, if you lose X amount of weight, right? Now, maybe within the next year, if your diet doesn't change too much, you don't move up a weight class, you probably be able to lose the same percentage of weight, right? So it is replicable within individuals, right? But that doesn't mean that you can repeat it from you to another individual, meaning that if I lose 1.8%, doesn't mean, Ryan, you're going to lose 1.8%. You might lose 2%, you might lose 1.3%, right? So, and
But
I think
it
that
sounds
is
like one thing, just so I understand correctly. Yeah, so between me and you, for sure, no correlation. But it sounds like if I lose around 2%, I do the same protocol, I can expect around 2% again, and there shouldn't be a lot of variation from there. One thing I did want to ask you, you brought females just before you, in case you're going to move on a little bit. So I get this question in there while we're on this topic. What about females? And it's brought up when they're in the menstrual cycle. Is that affected by the gut cut anyways? And then we could talk about water loading, etc., later on. But just gut cut specifically, is that affected?
so when it comes to a research setting, right? As Eric mentioned in the lab, there's a lot of things that we try to control. It's quite I mean, to a certain extent, it's kind of like an artificial environment, right? Because Eric mentioned in training, you don't have your mates like shouting, like five people shouting at you at the same time, all right?
Mm.
And the intensity of like how the loudness of how the encouragement we give in the lab is we have to try to keep it consistent, because let's just say you go in the train with your mate one day and your mate was like have a sore throat, he won't be able to shout at you as much, But in the lab, we have like the same individuals and we try to keep like the encouragement the same, right? And that controlled setting applies very much to how we did the gut cutting as well. So essentially, when we asked females, we said that we get them to repeat it at the same time of their cycle, right? So it's essentially the same period of time. Or if they are on some form of hormonal birth control, right, they just have to keep taking it, and we keep that consistent during when we repeat the trial. So we're essentially trying to minimize potential variation that people will say, okay, what about this? Could this have impacted things, right? And obviously humans, we have like day-to-day fluctuations, right? Like, okay, cool, maybe I'm a little bit more stressful today. Maybe I retain slightly more weight, right? But what that's why when we have like certain things like randomization, collecting a larger amount of sample, having larger amount of sample size, and hopefully that kind of like evens out like all these minute errors that we cannot control for. Like I can't control, like I don't know if you weigh in like roughly, let's just say you weigh in 30 minutes later than this day because you woke up late, right, for 30 minutes. That's probably not going to impact things as much if it's like spread across a larger sample size compared to someone is like on their menstrual cycle and we don't control for that. So for the things that we can control, which are kind of like things that have a potential large impact on the data, we control for it. And those that we cannot control, like I said, people do not live in a vacuum. Hopefully, like the sample size and randomization kind of like evens that out. So that's kind of like how a brief insight into the research methods, that when we try to conduct the experiment. Not to mention, like one thing that my study did as well compared to full study, they actually got them to manage to actually calculate fiber, right? So and then they standardized the fiber intake. But mine, I didn't do that because working with powerlifters, right? I know that first of all, a lot of them cannot even like track their macronutrients as well, and fiber is another additional component. So I just be like, instead of standardizing the fiber intake, because there's also a chance that if someone doesn't consume like 15 grams of fiber and they consume only 10, right, then they may be actually consuming more fiber. So what we did was we just said, these are the foods that you want to avoid, right? And this is are the foods that you can replace it and try to hit these macronutrients, which is at maintenance, at your maintenance calories. And it's kind of like what Eric said, it's more like a real world, it's how powerlifters do their cuts. So we're trying to say that, cool, if you are really the type that really want to count fiber, and maybe you don't want to leave anything, no, any stone unturned, you can do that as well. But if you want to take a slightly more lax approach, as long as you do this, you don't have to count your fiber, and uh, you still can lose X amount. And it is likely that if you do the same thing again, you lose the same amount again, right? So it's kind of like saying, that a couple of roads lead to Rome, and you just pick the road that fits you the best. Because there are some lifters who are highly neurotic, and they're like, I need to track every single thing. Sure, go ahead. But some will be like, okay, cool. If I track every single thing, I'll actually lose my mind. But sure, you don't have to do it. You still can lose X amount of weight. So that's kind of like, I would say like the summary of like the research in the gut cutting sphere.
And if I may, uh, there's some interesting interactions here because the like traditional quote unquote approach to this is kind of borrowed from preparation for like a stomach surgery or getting a probe in your gut, where you need to have an empty bowel. Yeah, and sometimes the approach is you go on a low fiber diet, you combine that with a pharmaceutical laxative, and we need you cleaned out so we can stick a camera around in there and see if you have any polyps or a cancerous cyst in your bowel, something like that. So some of these studies are not even necessarily done in the context of powerlifting. So what I really like about Kedric's research is it's what's called a complex intervention, meaning that we are unable to isolate the specific component of the dietary manipulation that directly caused the thing that we saw, and more so we can say, hey, this approach where you reduce your carbohydrate intake, you avoid high fiber foods, and we keep it isocaloric, so you're not in an energy deficit, it produced this weight loss. We're not claiming it was the low fiber component or the low carb component. And it probably wasn't just one of those things, Ryan, because there's some interesting effects here. So fiber is a healthy thing to consume, and it improves, symptoms like constipation or, being a little too loose of stool, depending upon where you start and what type of fiber you're consuming. But one of the ways that some types of fibers help with gut health is that they draw more fluid into the gut, and they make your bowel movements more consistent, because they kind of like hydrate your poo, right? So in some ways, a gut cut actually does result in a loss of body water, but it's not resulting in a loss of body water from tissues that you would think would impact performance. The actual weight of the gut contents goes down because there is less water in the gut. There's less fiber, and there's a bunch of different types of fiber, but the actual food bulk itself goes down because some fiber is non-digestible by humans, right? Others are partially digestible in the large intestine by the gut microbiota, and it's used for fuel, and we do get calories from it. But nonetheless, you have some fiber which speeds up, with some fiber which slows down the process of gastric emptying, or I should say, taking a dump, and that is part of it. So there is some reduction in gut water contents, and there is also a reduction in just the total amount of food in your gut. But that can also be done just from the carbohydrate content. So for anyone who does track macronutrients, you might know that there is 4 calories on average per gram of carbohydrate and 9 calories per gram of fat. That means, and you think about this not just from kind of a macronutrient perspective, but just from foods, that means that fat has more energy per unit of weight. So when you shift to a higher fat diet, you're able to get the same amount of calories with less total food weight. And additionally, the water and fiber content and structure of foods can mean that they weigh more or less while providing different amounts of energy. So if you eat a large apple, that might be a big old apple of like, say, 200 grams. That's going to
Mm.
be 150 calories for 200 grams. But if you were to drink 200 grams of olive oil, that's 200 grams of fat, right? That's like 1,800 calories, you know? So I think that type of understanding helps you see that you can get calories from lower food weight. So, as a really practical example, one of my go-to foods when I have an athlete do a gut cut is chocolate. It is relatively high in fat. It has added sugar. It's relatively high in sugar, but it's relatively low in fiber, and you can get a lot of energy from it. And then you drink some protein shakes on top of that, or you just eat some fatty meats. Not something that'll take a huge amount of time to digest, stuff that's easy on the stomach, and you can have your food weight drop from a kilogram per day to 500 grams per day, and you will immediately see a 1.5 kilogram loss on the scale if you do that for enough days. And that can even compound if you're also shifting to a lower fiber intake and you have less total gut mass. So it really depends upon what is your habitual diet. If someone is consuming a very high fruit and vegetable, healthy dietary pattern, and they switch to something that is more like a mostly chocolate based diet, they will see a larger return on that gut cut than if you're already consuming a relatively unhealthy dietary pattern. And you, like Kedric was saying, the reason why we didn't just institute, okay, you're going to consume 10 grams of fiber per day is what if someone's only consuming 8 grams of fiber per day? It's actually an increase, you know? And we can all think of a few people in powerlifting who kind of eat like they're not only a child, but they're a child on on Halloween. So it's, I think it's something that you do have to be aware of that. And to your point, Ryan, some women, and this is by no means consistent across women, there are larger differences between women. There are even between men and women on average, and somehow, and some of these quote unquote sex-based differences, they experience pretty large changes in digestion. They get constipated, or they may even have near like diarrhea-esque symptoms during different phases of their menstrual cycle. The bloating and cramping that they experience is not just going on in their female parts, but also can impact their digestive time course. Not always, not to a major degree, but potentially that's there. Additionally, when you are dieting, not doing acute rapid weight cut, which we've been talking about primarily, but dropping body fat, being in an energy deficit over time, that can impact digestion. If anyone is aware of the concept of low energy availability or relative energy deficiency in sport, this is very common in weight class based sports like powerlifting, especially in middle and lower weight classes, where people are trying to walk around quite lean so they can be in a lower weight class. And to do that, they often have to restrict energy, and they're in a chronic state of what we call low energy availability. They're not consuming enough energy, both for the demands of their sport, their activity levels, as well as all of the physiological needs of their body. This area of research grew out of what's called the female athlete triad, which is a little more popular consciousness. You've probably heard of that, and you think, oh, that's when women have like a disordered eating pattern, a loss of their menstrual cycle, and they may even have losses of bone because they're producing less estrogen, and there's also malnutrition through a low micronutrient intake, low mineral intake, and you're seeing this compounding effect, and you see an increase in fracture risk. Well, that's actually something that equivalent things happen in men as well. Anyone who doesn't eat enough to properly fuel their body and also properly fuel their sport to reduce their weight, they're playing a bit of a dangerous game. And there are numerous effects of being malnourished as an athlete. And one of them is that it has negative effects on digestion. And I see this all the time in bodybuilders because there's no avoiding low energy availability when you're trying to get shredded, is that you go from having a bowel movement frequency of, say, daily to then maybe halfway through prep, it's every other day, and then maybe really deep into contest prep, when you're even leaner than some of the folks we were talking about who've dropped a weight class, you're seeing a bowel movement frequency of twice a week. So you can imagine that in those cases, there's a pretty big change in the amount of gut contents and the diet that you're following relative to another time period. And as someone who's competed in the 93 as well as the 83 kilo weight class, and when I'm at 83, I'm nearly in stage condition. I can tell you that the gut cut has a very different effect. So you don't necessarily always drop the same amount if you've had seen a pretty large change in your scale weight. Um, and when you look at higher weight class athletes who have to consume a lot of food, and they're kind of experiencing the inverse of relative energy deficiency, where they're consuming so much food to try to be really, really heavy, weight will come off their body real quick, you know? So we're talking about lightweight athletes trying to almost squeeze blood from a stone, but we can also talk about folks like, you know, a Jesus Olivares or a Ray Williams or a Kelly Branton who they have an extra long layover, they get stuck on a plane and they drop 5 kilos because their body is just ready to let go of that and they can have a negative impact on their performance and experience. So you're not necessarily the same body if you're someone who's competed across multiple weight classes. And yes, there are those some changes that are going to be different between different people. Some women have very light menstrual cycles. They don't bleed a lot. They don't experience too much breast tenderness. They don't experience a lot of cramping. And other women need to be actually, you know, taking prophylactics and analgesics to deal with that. And it has a negative impact on their performance, while others it does not. So there's a tremendous amount of inter-individual variability. But I think what we did show in Kedric's research is that within the same weight class for you, at energy balance, which I think is important, where these people are still consuming maintenance energy. They just increase their proportion of fat, decrease their proportion of carbohydrate, decrease fiber, and reduce the overall weight of the food in their gut. Yes, you can see a consistent loss of a surprisingly high amount, in my opinion. Knowing that there's a fair amount of people who lost like 1.5% of their body weight, that's more than a kilo. You know, that's a
Yeah.
good chunk of weight that you can cut that we theoretically would not think would impact performance, unlike broader dehydration, which results in dehydration of muscle tissue, you know, dehydration of all tissues in the body. So, you know, losing water out of your gut, that's not a problem. You know, that, you know, hydrated piece of poo was not helping you do, you know, squat more. But, you know, you
That's why I've
seeing
heard of
your
Kedrick is.
dehydrated piece of poo.
No, a
Yes, that's
hydrated piece of poo.
oh, he's a hydrated piece of poo. I guess that's better
One
than
time
being
when
a
I was angry
dehydrated.
and I am sorry for that DM, but I was angry and you had said something, forget about it.
That's a creative insult. I'll give you that at least, Ryan.
But I have one question though. Well, I got a couple questions, but we'll jump back on. I don't want to pull us off track. This is phenomenal stuff. Um, you hear some people talk about when they lose a lot of body weight, and we're talking about what it does to the impact of these individuals. You were going in, like the changes they'll feel physically. And some people say, like, I crashed my hormones. I got so light in body fat. We hear about women stop having menstrual cycles, and men also have felt effects. And I don't know if their testosterone levels drop because due to body
Yes.
fat, but people talk about this, and it greatly can impact their performance. And I don't know if some people realize this. You don't even have. Well, let me ask you, what does that look like? Could Is this only if you go to an extreme of bodybuilding that a woman's going to lose their menstrual cycle, or a man could crash his testosterone, or has it been seen in other sports like boxers, powerlifters, track athletes, or any kind of endurance athletes where they get so lean, women lose menstrual cycles? What does that do to them? What does that do to their performance? Is it nothing to be worried about, or no? No, that is for sure going to take away, the gas in the gas tank. That fatigue failure for sure is going to pop up a lot sooner than you would like if you're an endurance athlete or a strength athlete. And the same thing for men in terms of the testosterone levels of strength just not being there. You got way too lean. Not just I don't have the calories or energy, but actually, you know what? You did some damage there. And what does that look like?
Ryan, I'm glad you asked about specifically being too lean because there's actually two interdependent, interrelated, but separate systems going on here. So ultimately, all of this is centrally mediated. It has to do with signaling in your hypothalamus, which is a portion of your brain, which then has knock-on effects on your adrenal axis, your gonadal axis. So the sex hormone systems, which we're talking about, and they're very replicable, and they have to do with specific hormonal systems, both metabolic and endocrine um, hormones. So what that means is that once you start to go into a large of enough energy deficit, or if you get really, really lean, you can have some of these similar overlapping effects. But they are actually two kind of independent ways of getting to the same place. So low energy availability, where you see these reductions in sex hormones and metabolic hormones and all these knock-on effects, like I was saying on the digestive tract, also affects the immune system. It affects the muscular system. It affects you psychologically. It is essentially what your body does in the same way that uh, a a company tries to cut costs during a recession. Your body does the same thing when you tell it, I don't have enough energy for everything you want to do. It goes, okay, well, I got to do some things. So, let's think you're working in a brick and mortar and they have an accounting team of five and you go through a recession. They're going to bring that accounting team down to three. And then all of a sudden you notice that it's 2 p.m. And you're the only one working in the office. Everyone is still on their lunch break. Maybe that's why it wasn't a recession. It's just, people taking too long at lunch breaks in this office while you're losing money. But you're there alone, doing the accounting. The other two are on break. The other two got fired. All of a sudden the lights go off. You're like, what's going on here? And you have to wave your hand. And you realize that they changed the lights to motion sensors to save a little bit of money on the energy bill. Your body does the equivalent of that. So you do see very repeatable and predictable reductions in testosterone and estrogen in men and women respectively. You also see reductions in testosterone in women. And this can happen independent from even the loss of body fat. So some of the seminal work by Luke's and colleagues would look at this is before it was called relative energy deficiency in sport or low energy availability. It was the female athlete triad research. In the 2000s, they would put women, sometimes women with obesity, so very high in body fat, on damn near starvation diets or very low energy diets. And within a few days, what they would see is a change in luteinizing hormone pulsatility. And that is just, I don't need to get into the physiology of it, but that is the kind of the early warning system of when there will be a disruption to the menstrual cycle. So you can actually induce oligoamenorrhea or amenorrhea in women who are very high in body fat just by putting them into a state of starvation. And this makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary biology perspective. Is the tribe going to survive if, you know, you have a little fun with your buddy in the cave? You got some friends with benefits back in Paleolithic times, Brenda and Tug Tug, they sneak into that little part of the
Wow.
cave where there's some naughty cave paintings and they have a little fun, but it's during the Ice Age. It's during the winter. There's no food availability. So what else are you going to do with your life? You got a whole bunch of the women are all out gathering berries, but there's no berries to be found. The men are all out trying to hunt, but there's no mastodons around, you know?
Yeah.
There's no food. So
Yeah.
we're just having to rely on our stored body fat and we're having to forage and hunt far and long across the plains of Africa to try to hopefully feed the tribe. Would it be a good idea right now for me to start growing another human in my womb and then when it comes out having to produce milk? The energy intensiveness of that, less than ideal. You're almost guaranteed to have killed that person and potentially other members of the tribe because you're all sharing a limited resource. So when there is low food availability and you are in a state of low energy availability, it can become uh, impossible to have a child.
Hmm.
And you don't have a menstrual cycle. So you can induce amenorrhea in women, and you can induce some of these changes in men, the parallel changes, immediately by going into heavy states of fasting for a prolonged period.
Sorry, so that
But
would evolutionarily, sorry to cut you off. That would be why
yeah,
men would be like Joey. Sorry, Joey B, but you brought it up on the podcast. You can lose your sex drive if you get too lean.
absolutely.
If you're a man, women lose the menstrual cycle because exactly what you said. Historically speaking, you should not be having kids right now. You cannot feed everybody. You're telling yourselves we can't afford to have another mouth to feed, so we're going to shut this off. It's for your own benefit.
Yeah.
You're
So
welcome.
you can induce this through basically crash dieting. You can have, if you try to lose a lot of weight over a shorter period, it'll go worse than if you lose that weight over a longer period. So that like on a day-to-day basis, the energy gap is smaller. And you see also more muscle loss when you try to diet fast versus diet slow. And this is why, Kedrick and I are almost always shaking our head when we get contacted by somebody. They're 6 weeks out from Worlds and they want to drop a weight class. We're like, God damn it. Like if you contacted me 16 weeks out, we would not have to do things which would hurt your performance. Um, but on top of that, there is the leanness issue. So I think there's several examples we've seen where people maybe have even done things right on paper, but they get to a weight class they seemingly can't sustain, right? Now, there's another effect because what everything I was just talking about was just the acute impact of having really low energy. But the mechanism behind that is immediately you see drops in a hormone called leptin. Leptin is a master hormone controller. So when you're on a really, really low energy diet, you see leptin levels get lower. But your serum leptin levels at energy balance, even when you're eating enough, are predicted by body fat levels. There's a cool study by Considine done where they took, I think, close to multiple hundreds of people across the spectrum of lean to with obesity, and they looked at the relationship between serum leptin levels. So leptin is kind of like the hormone that I mentioned earlier, signals the hypothalamus to say, hey, are we in a status of energy sufficiency? And here's the cool thing, Ryan. Energy levels scale proportionately with body fat percentage. Because body fat is not just something that sits on us. Adipose tissue, human body fat, is a organ, and it secretes leptin. So there's two things that impact your leptin levels. There is how much body fat do you have on you, and relative to your own individual quote unquote normative levels. Because some people have naturally lower body fat levels, some people have naturally higher. They secrete similar amounts of leptin, but the leptin sensitivity and receptors in other tissues are better at onboarding it. And there's also other factors which dictate what is your quote unquote normal body fat range. But at energy balance, when you're not dieting, if you have a high level of body fat, you have high levels of leptin. If you have low levels of body fat, you have low levels of leptin. So there is a theory of body fat regulation, which is the one that has not yet been disconfirmed or disproved, which seems to match what we see best, called the dual intervention point model. And sometimes we talk about this colloquially as like, oh, my set point. And that is not perfect because we actually know that we don't have just one point that our body defends. Most people, if they try to get really, really, really heavy, at a certain point, it just becomes really hard to get a lot heavier. Now, our modern environment, the obesity epidemic has shown that if we make food really tasty, available, energy dense, and we don't move at all and we work from
Mm,
home, we can overwhelm
mm.
this. And our bodies are much better at defending against weight loss than weight gain because we're not a prey species. We were at threat from famine, like I was talking about, far more often than we were at threat from predators. But prey animals, like in rodent models and mouse model studies, they're actually really good at defending weight gain and weight loss because a fat mouse is slow and tasty for a predator. But we humans, we've had sticks and fire and caves for a long time. We have not been primarily at threat from predators for a long time. And the main threat to us is food scarcity. And when there is scarce food and it negatively impacts our immune system, then things like the Spanish flu or the bubonic plague or just a winter, are more likely for us to catch ill and die and see the species fail. So we're really, really good at defending against weight loss. And that is probably why the obesity epidemic is there, because we're not quite as good at defending against the upper range. But nonetheless, we have this system in place called the dual intervention model, where we start to get these physiological changes where we get below our lower intervention point. That's one of the dual intervention points, or the upper intervention point that tries to either reduce our hunger and increase energy expenditure on the high end, but not well enough to, overcome the modern environment and prevent obesity. But much more consistently on the lower end, because that's how we're here today and survived as a species, we can decrease energy expenditure, increase hunger hormones, make you feel terrible, and make you just be like, get up, go out, don't sleep, gather some berries, hunt some stuff, eat it, and gain weight. And when you get really, really lean, even when you're eating enough, and this is where it parallels directly to powerlifting. We've seen some of these lifters, we talked about Chell, and I know he's been open about it, so I don't want to, we're not bringing his business anything that he hasn't talked about openly. He got down and he did it. He kicked that world record down the track at Sheffield, 770. Whoa, crazy. And we all anticipated he's going to be the male Evie. He's going to chill at the 66 weight class, no problem. 770 is just the start. Wait till he starts eating up. And maybe, perhaps, that is a little difference between Evie and Chell. Perhaps his lower intervention point is a little bit higher relative to his male physiology than Evie's is. Evie is, certainly she would enjoy eating more food, but she is not so lean that she's unable to perform, recover, train, and improve, or at least maintain. And we've seen her total get close to that 490 mark, while we actually saw Chell have to remake weight to get back to 74, not 66, when he did Euros. And he's like, no, I'm done with this because he felt consistently like crap. So he was able to get there and perform once, but the longer time he spent at that point, he started to circle the drain. And this is the
Mm.
whole reason why bodybuilders don't stay shredded, right? This is why I normally compete at 93, not 83, because at 83, I don't sleep through the night very well. My performance isn't great. And when I decide to do a powerlifting meet at 83 in the middle of one of my bodybuilding contest preps, I do it like as soon as I'm around 84, 85, I cut water, I get there, and then I'm going, sweet, now I'm just going to focus on looking good because I sure as hell don't feel good. Even though I might look like I'm strong, I sure as hell ain't. And the reality is that there is such thing as too lean, and there is such a thing as dieting too hard. And when you combine the two, it's a double whammy. And that's why it's very challenging. And not everyone should be cutting weight. It's not just whether or not you're too lean, Ryan, but it's also how did you get there? And then how long did you try to stay there? Because you can restore calories, but if you're still too lean, you're never going to fully quite recover. And that's why some weight classes are just not a good fit for certain athletes. And it's also why we see selection in sport. If you look at weightlifting, which has been around a little bit longer, and it's a lot more popular in, say, Asia, China, and the Eastern Bloc because it's an Olympic sport. There's more funding in it. You will see that there's a very consistent physique across middleweight and lightweight weightlifters. You see people like Liu Xiaojin, and you see dudes and gals in these lower weight classes in weightlifting, which has a little more participation in that part of the world, who are walking around in damn near bodybuilding shape. And that's because the ones who can succeed at the highest level, the sport doesn't make them look like that. If you want to be the best, 70, 80 kilo-ish male, because, the weight classes have changed in weightlifting, in that highly competitive environment where the fifth place person at Chinese nationals could probably beat everybody else, and they've got a waiting list of who's going to go get a gold medal this year, those athletes are all selected by the sport. They can only get to that level and be competitive when they have all the right genetic advantages that line up. And when you've got a nation of 1.3 billion people and they'll take care of your family and pay you to go compete and pay you per gold medals, yeah, you've got a whole bunch of people who are just naturally shredded, have fantastic anthropometry and shape, and they even have a sports selection identification talent ID program there. You start to see what happens. And only certain people can fit the mold to do well in that sport. If you're sitting down next time the Olympics roll around and one of your friends goes, oh, look at that. Swimming makes everybody kind of have that same broad shoulder build. It's like, no, 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 no. Swimming doesn't make swimmers look like that. You're only going to
Mm.
be competing at the Olympic level if you look like that in swimming.
Mhm.
And we're starting to see the same thing for lightweight and middleweight powerlifters. That if you want to be at the highest level, if you want to be competitive in Sheffield, and you want to be in a 66 or 74 kilo weight class, then you need to be able to actually have the physiology that supports you being there while still having a crap ton of muscle.
Couple things that are interesting. First off, yeah, 100%. You're abnormal to be taller in powerlifting. Not totally like you'll have outliers, and I understand powerlifting is relatively in terms of maturation still, I wouldn't say infancy at this point. It's the classic though, beginning on the IPF side, 2012. I mean, that's not a whole lot of time, but for in Olympic sports like sprinting, athletes in the 100 meters were usually around 5'9", 5'10". You look at how many world champions, Olympic champions were around 5'9", 5'10". And when Usain Bolt came around at 6'5", the Jamaican track team, which is obviously it's Americans and Jamaicans forever. Even when Canada won twice the gold medal, they were Jamaican Canadians. I mean, it's no like the Jamaican track team knows what they're doing, and they told you saying you're 6'5". You're not built for 100 meters. Physiologically, with your build, you can't unravel quick enough for 100 meters. You're 200-meter or up. And I mean, they were right. He's fantastic at 200 meters, but he ended up making it work. Every now and then, so I say that just to say, every
Yeah.
now and then, it doesn't mean you won't have outliers who make it work. You know, Pana is kind of a taller 66. You'll have the odd guy who's a taller 93, but you'll have a lot of Russell Orhii, Gavin Aidens at
Yes.
93 who are going to be, in 5 foot, whatever in the middle. I'm not trying to out my boys here, but for the height shaving, but it's a it's a shorter athlete sport to a large extent. So you're right. I mean, this is kind of a different discussion, but there is when you look at certain sports, that's just fact. Same with basketball, whatever, being taller, etc. But you'll have a couple outliers. And then on the flip side, you had mentioned how even if you're obese, if you drastically cut off your food inappropriately, crash diet, you're going to start showing symptoms like your body starts doing things that symptoms like you're starving when you clearly have weight to lose. I remember reading a post of, and I'm not going to start doxing at this, but individual clearly obese saying, hey, this is my body. You know what? I tried to diet and it didn't work for me. I swear to God, I started losing my hair. I started just saying all these wild symptoms. And this individual was for sure obese. And reading it, I mean, you're not going to say much, but you're like, how did you do it? That's anecdotal. It doesn't mean that you're supposed to be that big and heavy. That does not mean that. And this individual took it as this is the way I'm supposed to be. This is my natural, but my body was telling me, no, this is you're supposed to be your body weight. Was it? Or was it your body saying, you're doing this wrong? I think you're starving. Are we in a cave and food is scarce? What is happening, etc.? Like you said about, caveman, cavewoman, and all of a sudden, look at I'm going to make it so you can't have babies. I'm going to do this, that, and the other. It might have nothing to do with the actual body fat and everything to do with what you just did. And there's so many different ways to get there. And if you take the wrong path, you could suffer symptoms and you might misread it and all of a sudden you fell into the same trap. Um, you know, the sun came up. I'm going to start worshiping. Blah blah blah. Like we already said, you're making storylines that aren't real. Um, so, anyways, these are all reasons why you want to get a coach. You'll
Yeah.
you'll go through experiences and you'll start telling yourself the reason why I got to B is because I took the path from A to B. And then your coach might say, actually, there's so many pathways and there's a lot of different reasons you ended up where you ended up and I can help guide you and there's easier ways. You don't have to go inside your car going through the freaking window. Let me open the door for you. And they got to hire individuals like you two. And yeah, I've been taking note on all your all the ways you lay it down for people, buddy. You're amazing at it. But yeah. So interesting. If people don't do this the right way and they get a little too greedy and they wait a little too late and they start doing some drastic things, they could suffer severe performance impact, severe, and then start telling themselves, tried it, had a horrible experience. I'm not a 63. I'm not an 83. I'm not. And in reality, it is, well, maybe you are, maybe you're not. I don't agree nor disagree, but let me check how you went about this. Let me take a look at this. Let science tell you. And it could be a whole different conversation after that. That is why if someone's listening to this podcast saying, yeah, I know how to do my macros, I know how to do gut cuts, gotcha. I know how to do water manipulation, gotcha. I'm going to try this out myself. That, my friends, is why you might want to grab a coach. a coach you trust and work this out with some guidance.
Yeah, and Ryan, it's really pertinent right now to kind of connect what you were saying, a few things that you were saying. So you mentioned that we talked about how sports selects, right? And you talked about height in powerlifting. The we always look up to the elite level athletes, and sometimes it just
Not
doesn't make sense
always
to do so.
on. All right,
Yes.
sorry.
No, no,
Okay,
to your
I'm
point.
done. We're done. We're done now. Go ahead.
Yeah, oftentimes we're looking down elite level athletes as tall, and but it's honestly, if I could give up some height, I would because I would rather be short and better at strength sport and physique sport. But anyway, I'll tell you this much: we often attribute correlation as causation as in amateur and regional level athletes when they look at the best in the game. Like there was a chart going around for a long time on how to know what weight class was appropriate for you. And it was based upon observations of the best lifters. And they go, oh, well, if you're 6 foot, you should be a 120. And if you're taller than that, you should be a super heavyweight. All those super heavies are kind of their own breed. They have big bone structure. And if you're this tall, you should be in this weight class. But that is exactly the confusion between correlation and causation. We're we're seeing sport select. You don't get to choose to have the same bone structure as an elite level lifter. So I love going to the European Powerlifting Conference every year because I learn just how much there's a difference between an 80th percentile lifter and a top level lifter. When I'm, when I go to the gym locally, I'm the strongest guy in the gym. When I go to the EPC, I am the weakest person in the room by a long shot. So I'll tell you what, Mike T and I are the same height. Mike T is like the heaviest weight I've ever been was what he weighed as a freshman in high school. And it's
It's
not like
gorilla.
Mike T is, yeah, Mike T is not high in body fat. Tony Cliff, these guys who are similar height to me have completely different bone structures. When I train with Mike T, it's hilarious how much time it takes to take the plates off the bar so we can train together, even though we have the same like rack heights, right? And if I could stand in front of him and you wouldn't see my silhouette if we turned off the lights, he could eat me and you wouldn't know it. And we'd be like, what did you do with Eric Helms? I fit inside him. My skeleton could fit inside his, right? So they just because we're the same height does not mean that I should be a 120. And in fact, I don't even know what I could do to get to 120. Post contest binging, after my first year as a novice bodybuilder, not knowing what I was getting into, got me up to 102. Like this is me with an eating disorder trying to get heavy and not being able to get within, 30 pounds of where he's at. So this is people thinking, oh, I need to be like the elite. You are not the elite. You should not necessarily just be copying what they're doing. They have a completely different genetic structure to you. And the same thing is being done in these surveys. So, Kedric, I think it would be good here to describe that you did that survey in 2018. You've done others at Worlds, and it indicated, 8 to 9 out of 10 of world class level lifters are cutting weight. But talk to us about, Nolan, G, and some of these other surveys on non-elite level lifters competing at the regional, state cup at the highest level. 85% of them are also cutting, and something
Crazy.
like 50% of them are engaging in active like weight loss, not just acute weight cuts, but they're going through phases of cutting weight while they're still developing and developing strength, and it's quite normal. The vast majority of powerlifters cut weight for competition regardless of their competitive level. And I know that, Kedric, you're really well known for helping athletes make weight, but you are absolutely not pro weight cuts. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this and what you think most lifters should be doing, despite the fact that top level lifters are cutting weight with great success.
Yeah, I think that my position actually still remains the same. I think, Ryan, we had a conversation back in the day where, I mentioned I think that there should be no weight classes for sub junior lifters, All right. I remember I actually like floated that idea out, and I still hold really, really strongly to that idea. I do think that uh, you know, but potentially the whole idea is what's the goal of the sport, right? And the previous conversation that we had on the sports science panel, we talked about like certain lifters peaking at a certain age. And if your goal is to actually go towards that level, right, you probably might want to think slightly long term. But we also did mention that a younger lifter might not have that long term view, potentially just due to the surrounding environment, like social media, or it could just be mental maturity, right? So it's like, oh yeah, and that might just be okay. I'll cut weight now, right? And I think when we look at kind of like sort of like people getting like a second win, like Taylor Edward going to the A3s, right? Russ going to the 93s, right? We see how they do within the next like 7 days. And then these are actually lifters who have already been in the weight class for a very, very long time, having a second win after moving up, right? So let's assume that being at a certain weight class for a specific time, you probably are not tapping into your potential during those formative years. Let's just say even it's like, let's put a number like 3% per year. And like Taylor has been 74 for like what? Like eight, a really, really long time, like 7 years. Like could obviously it's not linear. So let's just say it's 20% across these years that he left on the table just by not moving up. Right. So that there could be something to be said that, you know, if you are trying to severely limit yourself in terms by cutting weight, you are definitely leaving some like potential in the tank just from the perspective of not fueling yourself enough over an extended period of time. When we look at muscle gain, right? We look at it. We know that muscle gain happens gradually, right? It, Eric's research, showed that if you have a high intake of calories within a short period of time versus a moderate intake, you probably you just gain more fat, right, within a short period of time. So I think that really shows that a smaller amount of energy intake across a longer period of time would probably translate better to lean mass gains, which means that once you have the lean mass gain for your new muscle tissue to actually be sort of like, let's just say, adapted towards producing high amounts of force, takes more time, which means that the essential theme is like all of these gains takes time. But if you're actually limiting yourself and not actually going through that, you are actually putting yourself as a disadvantage if your goal is to be as strong as you can at X like year, like maybe when you're late 20s or early 30s. And I also do think that one very important element when we mention Chell is that Chell recently turned 37, right? He's a dad with 2 young children, and trying to make a lot of these kind of gains it's much, much harder when you have people like you are responsible for other than yourself. Like, hey, instead of now just feeding myself, I had to feed my tribe as well. So I probably would be like, in obviously Charles he's not faced with this situation, but in a period of scarcity, I can't just eat all the calories for myself just because I want to get jacked, and then let my my infant die, right? So I think that responsibility as well.
The name of gains
is, yeah, I know Ryan's really for letting the infant die, because you always like.
If I was a caveman, I'd be the only, don't make me make that choice. Continue.
Tribe of one.
Yeah. And when we look at things like how well you can kind of like progress, I think that there are certain formative years, when you have less responsibilities and you're just accountable for yourself. Typically those would be really, really good years to kind of like build up. And if we look at certain, I mean, there's always like outliers. Like for example, like obviously Agatha is a massive outlier, right? But a lot of the lifters who are actually like performing well, they tend to be peaking at a slightly later age. And I do think that this really goes back to the point when we look at certain research as well, and we draw parallels with combat sports. And the reason why combat sports is being studied so intensely is because there's a lot of detrimental health effects, both from a physiological and a psychological element. But the difference between combat sports is not just the severity of the cut, but the frequency of the cut. All right, like martial artists, they fight like 10 times a year, right? Which means that they weight cycle so frequently. And to your point, Ryan, when you mentioned about somebody, that person, losing hair because they are already obese. I think that when you are doing things wrongly, you actually deprive yourself of certain like micronutrients, right? So, for example, like one thing we know is that iron is pretty important, but meat, protein sources that contain iron also tend to be high in calories. And if you just eat only chicken breast, and if you're not finding ways to get iron from some other sources, you'll be deprived of iron, right? Certain vitamins like vitamin D, right? You could also be deprived if you're essentially eating the same thing day in, day out. And people are creatures of habit. And once they find something that works, they usually stick to it. They'll be depriving themselves of micronutrients, and that could actually impact health. And we actually see this very prominently in combat sports because they weight cycle so frequently. And when they look at their micronutrient profile, right, you can actually they actually see decreases in certain essential micronutrients across the time course of a year. And now the reason why I bring this up is that just imagine this scenario when you're a younger lifter and your body wants to grow, but you want to maintain a weight class. You're essentially not just weight cycling, but you're just depriving your body of all the nutrients throughout that year because you don't want to move up a weight class, right? So you would be leaving some gains on the table, not just from the fact that you are actually not allowing your body to put on lean muscle mass, but if you're not eating the right kind of stuff because X amount of food contains more calories, and if you eat too many calories, your body weight will go up, your micronutrient profile will be really, really low, right? And I think that comes into perspective. I think this puts into perspective what nutrition really is like. It's not just calories. It's just not macronutrients, right? As human beings, we eat food. We don't eat macros. We eat like food. We eat a meal, right? And I think that is something that is very kind of like important because at the end of the day, even for example, we mentioned people like Chell. The longer you are doing something, the more sort of like mental fatigue you will get. Your life kind of sucks because you can't eat food. And then when you're stressed, when people usually turn to food to sort of like, emotionally eat or cope, you can't, and it almost seems like the amount of effort you have to put in for every 100 gram increases exponentially. And to a point, you would find that like all this is not worth it anymore. Then you move up, right? But how many people has actually done that at a younger age where they find it not worth too early and then they quit the sport, right? If you're under feeling, so for example, I'm just maybe like 2 inches shorter than Eric, right? So like just slightly shorter. I compete as a 3 kilo weight class. By any standard, I should at least be 110. But I tell people that I think before I reach 110, I would actually die of a heart attack, right? Just because of
We'll love to see
the way.
but go on.
Yeah. But
you at 110, not die of a heart attack. Go on, sorry.
Yeah. But I would say that when I was a 74 kilo lifter, right, my injury risk, right, like I would spend 30, 40 minutes foam rolling, mobility, and all that kind of stuff, right? And I still get injured more frequently, right? But that time I was like lean, right? I had I was like pretty shredded. But just as soon as I move up to the A3, I can just go under the bar and just do the same thing, right? And I am lifting more weights now, right? So the absolute load is increasing, and I don't get hurt as frequently, right? And I think that the balance of all this, putting it into one whole picture, is that if I ask myself, if I continually stay at 74 and I'm doing powerlifting, a sport which for most people doesn't pay, but I have to put all this effort just to get injured, start from square one, do it again. And when I go out with my mates, when they have like a chocolate cake or a brownie, I wouldn't be able to eat that. But I'm sitting there with my back, hurting on one side and my knee on the other. I'm like, man, like, why am I even doing this? And that's why people quit. I think that people underestimate the mental burden of not meeting their expectations because they think if I stay, and usually this is how it works, right? Like, I stay at this weight class because I believe I can hit this total at this weight class. And therefore, I stay in this weight class. But if you're not hitting that total and you're constantly every time you take one step forward, you go 3 steps back, right? And the goal is getting further and further and further away. be like, okay, cool, I'm done with this sport. But maybe the fact is that you just move up and maybe your total will be way higher than what you can probably hit. So I think that is just something people have to kind of like understand. And sometimes a coach, that's the role of a coach, right? When I speak to my lifters, the lifters that I coach, I often use three guidelines to it's a broad structure to kind of evaluate when should you like stop the cut. I usually to simplify it, I call it the three P's. So you have the physiological aspect. So especially for females, one would be losing their menstrual cycle, right? So there's a physiological aspect that's a red flag, right? Second would be your psychological aspect is your relationship with food. How are you feeling when it comes to like eating food? Do you feel food is very like transactional, or if I like eat something more, I have to like go run? So you just develop this very unhealthy relationship with food. And the last P is your performance, because essentially powerlifting, you want to put up your highest total. And if your total is actually not going up, you're putting in all that effort, or even if, as a matter of fact, your total is dropping back. I think like this is like the weight class that that should not be you should not be in, right? So I always have this honest conversation with the lifters that I coach. I said this is very important. These are the criteria that I think you should evaluate, and of course I don't force it on them, right? I say that from a person that, as Eric mentioned, managed a lot of the big cuts that we have seen in the past. EB Corrigan going to 52, right? Chell going to 66, Agatha Shitko going to 63.4, right? This is not, even though I've done a lot of that, this is not like what I advocate for. My role is, because I don't advocate for this, I know how to manage it better. And I think that's why people work with me, because of that reason. It's not because they come to me because I'm a yes man that we cheer them on. And all these lifters that I work with, I tell them the same thing. These are the things that you need to focus on. And like, it's just that in the field, there isn't really as many people in this specific area. So I always say in the land of the blind, the one eye man is king, right? So I just tend to be the guy with three three eyes, because I have one eye and my glasses. So that's why people come gravitate towards me, right? And I think that as the field expands and with more expertise in the area, it would not seem that Kedric's the only guy that does big cuts, because people will get more expertise, and I'm very very happy if that when that happens, because like I said, there's only when I work with people, I come from the perspective of I know all this ill and negative impacts. And the fact of the matter is that, powerlifters having a, let's just put it mildly, a slightly different psychological profile than people. We say, oh, powerlifters are always on the spectrum. They're going to do it with or without your help. And I usually just say, if you're going to go to hell anyway, and you've already made up your mind before you come speak to me, you are coming to me not because you want to hear my opinion. You are coming to me and you're saying that I'm really going to do it. Will you help me or not? Right. And as of now, I think that because the field is not as established, I don't see anyone else that can help you manage it as well as I think I can. Therefore, I would help you do this, because I don't want I don't want to put you in a position where you have very deleterious consequences, right? So that is like my strong position is really, it's kind of like harm mitigation to a certain extent, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not that I am better than anyone. It's just that, like I said, you have that availability bias. When more people come to you, you have more experience learning how to manage that, and therefore you know how to manage multiple different situations. I have big cuts from females. I have big cuts from males now, right? Prior to Chell, it was only EV, so I know how to manage big cuts for females, right? And then now I know how to manage more, right? So moving down an entire weight class. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like my position is really, really thinking about like harm mitigation. I think if you come from the perspective of, if I lose my weight, how much can I gain? You're just in that cycle of like, you put yourself in a cycle
Yes.
of really unrealistic expectation. It's more of like, if I lose my weight, how much can I not lose? Right. And you're already starting from a position as like, there's a potential for loss, rather than then this intervention would make me gain so much more. And I think that's a better way to kind of like frame weight cutting.
It's good performance never came from impatience. And I can't tell you as a coach over the years and just as a competitor and being in and around the sport how often people work very hard to get to the intermediate stage of strength. And then they Their strength progress naturally slows down as it does, which we talked about in the last sports science episode. And they look on the other side of the fence down a weight class. They go, you know what? My total's okay for a 105, but if I was a 93, I'd be on the podium at nationals.
Mm.
And it's basically saying, you know what? Instead of getting strong, I'm going to try to get a little cheat code to be strong. If I could just maintain this strength down to 93, and it's like, how about instead of trying to game the system to get strong, just be patient to get stronger? Because it almost never works out. We see the times when it does because among elite level lifters, it has a big payoff, and if you do it well. But there are so many intermediate level lifters who never become advanced because they're trying to short circuit that process. They're not putting in another 5 or 6 years. They're putting in repeated weight cuts until they burn out of the sport, trying to cut down, and they're not doing it well. And for what? 85, 87, maybe 90% of weightlifters and powerlifters are cutting weight, and zero point 0.8, 0.9% of them are competing at a high level. So why are you cutting weight to place 10th at the Northwest Regional Idaho Championships? It's not in your best interest. And I really do think that unless you are looking to qualify for nationals in a large country, or place at nationals in a smaller country, or qualify for an international competition, you really shouldn't be cutting weight. You should be focusing on becoming a better powerlifter, which is best done, like any sport, by fueling your performance. Now, let's say you're someone who, came to powerlifting, because it's not like in most places besides Texas, you're playing high school powerlifting, right? Most of the time, it's adults who got into lifting weights, heard about this whole cool powerlifting thing, and then fell into it. And sometimes it's part of their overall fitness and health journey. So they might be somebody with obesity who's getting into powerlifting and they're losing weight over time. That's a specific scenario that I'm not talking about. But let's say you are someone who is at a relatively quote unquote normal body weight, and you get to this point where you go from I like to lift weights to, oh, I'm pretty serious about this powerlifting thing. It becomes very attractive, the idea of maintaining or even slightly improving your total and going down a weight class or two, and thinking that that's going to be what takes you to the next level. 8 out of 10 times, 9 out of 10 times, it's not. And even if it was, the next level is still nothing that's worth it. Like, you're going to now qualify for nationals and place 35th, and you took basically a year cutting down a weight class and maintaining a weight class where your total's actually gone down. Your coefficient went up. You became a more relative competitively in, say, the 83 versus the 93 class. But was it worth it? Because no one, I mean, of course, this should be our own intrinsic motivation, but there's a lot of opportunities just to put in the years, put in the time, be patient, and actually enjoy it rather than dealing with all the things Kedric talked about, than trying to fast track it by being in a weight class that you really have no business being in. Or even if you do have business being in it, you get there to then place 15th in Idaho. Like, I think people have not thought it through. And it comes from a place of insecurity and impatience. They don't want to feel embarrassed. Like, oh, like I want my total to be more respectable. Do this for you, not for other people. Like, you're not really being judged because you had a 600 total at 93 and you think it's trash. That's actually pretty damn good. You're just following everyone on Instagram, which self-selects for the
Mm.
best lifters in the world. So I think elite level sport and sport in general are very, very different. And I love following elite level sport. But as someone who has coached athletes at all levels, people let that get in their head too much and they kind of miss the point of all the amazing things powerlifting brings to you. That's not, I got to go compete at Sheffield, or I got to be a national champion or world champion or whatever. And I think you have to realize that that's cool, that's inspiring. Those are the leaders of our sport. We should be giving them the accolades. That's great. But 99% of powerlifters are not that. And trying to be it can actually make powerlifting a worse experience for you. So be patient. Think about being a lifelong lifter. And the reality is that your best peak potential, even if it is at the level of getting to worlds, like, I think about myself, like, if I had only just purely focused on powerlifting and not focused on bodybuilding and getting to my peak potential where maybe I can make a world's team one day and like as a masters lifter, That doesn't happen if I spend all this time in and out of dieting and spinning my wheels and not putting in every ounce. Like if I barely have the genetic goods to be, decent, I don't get to spin my wheels. Or now I'm not even going to be decent. So I think you really have to give yourself every advantage. And the fact that 90% of powerlifters cut weight is an example of probably 90% of those 90% not giving themselves every advantage.
I got a few things. I made some notes here. I want to dive in. You guys hit some great points. A couple things off the hop. So, Kedric, you had talked about sub juniors, juniors maybe should not be cutting weight, and we had this conversation before. But again, Joe B said he suspects as a junior, sub junior cutting weight, he might have actually cut height. I thought he was joking. He said, I'm dead serious. I wonder if while I'm still growing and I was cutting my calories, what impact that might have been. And then I was like, well, that's interesting. I wonder how people might make these decisions. If you're a sub junior, you want to cut weight. It's like, okay, cool. You were going to be a 6 foot man, but now you're going to be a 5'9" man. I just want you to know that. So you go ahead, do whatever you want to do. I brought this up to you before. Um, and you had said, I'm not sure. I can't remember if you had research or anything to bring, but you're like, as a hypothesis, you said there are nations where the average height is definitely lower and the calorie intake, food scarcity, etc potentially could be a reason for it. I can't remember if we, because I dropped this on you, and I don't know if you had previously read something about this, or if you're like, look at, I mean, it's interesting. I'd have to look into it, but it may make sense looking at the world as we know it. There definitely are nations where when there isn't a lot of food, I mean, actual scarcity, height is down. And that might not be the craziest. Now, could that be genetic? Sure. I don't know if there's research, or could it be with while you're growing and there's a scarcity of calories, it's not the right time to have a scarcity of calories. And if that's true, if that's true, sub juniors and juniors, if you're listening to this, you think about that the rest of your fucking life. You're going to be, you're going to greatly impact yourself. I don't know. I don't know. On that dating app, you don't want to hit that dating app with a 5 on your height, Playboy. You better be pretty freaking funny and charismatic if you're going to do that. All right. So, anyways, there's one thing. I guess we could
I
stay
can,
there for a
I
second.
you want me
I got a couple things I got to drop back on, so I'll drop back. Go ahead.
if I can address that one quickly because it's actually really
Sure.
interesting if you study the history of human society anthropology. So there's an interesting change in average human height over different eras of our development and societies. So if you go to pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer societies that lived in areas where hunter-gathering was relatively easy, so we're not talking about really extreme rough spots, you actually saw an average higher height than when early agriculture or farming started. You had an average height of, in say, European pre-agricultural men of about 5'9" and women around 5'5". That's not too dissimilar from today. And that was believed to be a reflection of a more varied and nutrient-rich diet. But then we get into the post-agricultural feudal era, where you're often relying on single crops, and it wasn't good to be a peasant in 1200 AD. You know what I'm saying? It's yeah, you're farming, you have access to food, but it's like a crop, and the Lord's coming down the pipe, taking all your stuff, and they're getting gout. They're being fed so well, they're throwing food you wish you had to dogs, right? So in
Mm,
this post-agricultural early period, the average height for men dropped to 5'5" and women to
mm,
5'1". So this is most likely uh, directly attributable to malnutrition. So then we get into a later stage of later stage agriculture, but still pre-industrial, where it's really interesting. Like if you look at if you look at images from the early days of photography, or if you look at early video, you will find nary a person with obesity, in this era. It's really rare, and it wasn't until we started to be able to not have to do any chores or move at all to get our food, and we had much higher levels of, obesity occurring in the last couple decades. But as modern medicine and agricultural came around, and we saw a decrease in famine, a decrease in disease load, once we start getting, immunization, and we start having nutrient fortification, around like post World War II era and things like that, that's when we start to get to the modern heights that we see today, where you have wide scale, sufficient nutrition. So yeah, there's a direct link to malnutrition and how much maturation you see. And absolutely, I think there's even data on people who wrestled. I think wrestlers tend to be shorter height on average if you wrestled in high school because you might have had a higher propensity of going through a bunch of weight cycling in high school. I haven't looked at that data in a while. Don't quote me on that. But that's something to consider as well. So there is absolutely links to that, Ryan, to your point.
Yeah.
Wow, I
I think
know. All right, so go ahead, Kendrick.
I think a very just recent comparison is that I think Ryan, you mentioned what about genetics? So I think when we look at very simple, just look at North Korea and South Korea. Prior to the
Mm.
split, they are quite ethnically homogenous, right? They are like kind of like they are Koreans basically. There's no North Koreans and South Koreans back in the day, back in the Choson era, it's just they're just Koreans. But
That's a
right
good
now,
good point.
the North Korean average male height is roughly 165 to 167 centimeters, whereas the South Koreans are actually 174 centimeters. And South Korean men are the tallest men in Asia, right? The tallest men uh, in the world are Dutchmen, right? Which is 183 centimeters, roughly around like that 6 foot, that's the average male height. Whereas in South Korea, it's like 5 feet 8. Uh, and in North Korea, it's like 5 feet 5, right? And even that is also seen in females, where the average female height in North Korea is around 154 centimeters to 157. So that's around like 5 foot to 5 foot 1. And South Korean women is around like 5 foot 3 to 5 foot 4, right? So it's almost you get roughly, I don't know, like 10, roughly 5 to 10 centimeters on average difference, just from uh I would say like chronic malnutrition, right? Because of course it takes some time for the impact to manifest itself across the generations, right? Uh, and that is also just something to I think that solidifies the fact that after an extended period of time it can impact your height, right? But for it to pass down, of course, to your generations, it has to be quite a fair bit of time, and it just shows that how chronic malnutrition or just underfeeding yourself can actually be impacting stuff. And like just what going back to the point that Eric raised from like uh evolutionary biology, right? Is that first of all, we have to kind of understand that in from an evolutionary perspective, having too much muscle mass is actually not really that advantageous, because it compared to a person who's normal, it can be slightly more metabolically costly in times of famine, right? So the only reason why I bring this up is just that it's not because I think people shouldn't gain muscle just in case they go into famine, but it's just like if you have more tissue, your body expand more to carry you across a similar amount of distance. And in a time of energy deficiency, right, that individual would likely suffer. That's why I say that when you have a zombie apocalypse, it's likely that the powerlifters are probably the most useless people because they can't do cardio and they are just too muscly, but they can't do anything and they just die in the famine when scarcity is there. So if you had to pick your team for a zombie apocalypse, try not to pick the powerlifter.
Get the
But
bodybuilders. They got you.
yeah, because they don't eat food, so you can eat all their food.
Hmm.
Uh,
Mm, I might grab
but
back at the shitco. That's where I differ, but go ahead.
but the but when you see the thing is this as well, to maintain a certain level of like just size or skeletal structure, you also need more energy intake. And if you're not providing energy intake to meet certain baseline requirements, it doesn't really, I mean, to me, at least logically, doesn't provide a signal for your body to grow, right? So like I think it really makes sense if you're just on chronic deprivation, then it will impact your factors that are related to just regular human physiological functions. I don't think that it's just isolated to height only. It could be other stuff. For all we know,
Yeah.
like I don't know whether people have actually that the amount of time where they say if you go through a dieting phase, does your hair grow slower than it, and your nails does it grow slower than if you were in a surplus? Uh,
Anecdotally,
so
it does. I can tell you that.
yeah, so I that those are things that people have to just consider. Just like normal human physiological functions come to a halt because if you think about it, menstruation isn't like a special thing, but it's just part of a normal human physiological functions, and that stops. So why, if something that is normal can stop, why shouldn't other normal human physiological functions also come to a halt or maybe a reduction? So at least kind of like that's how
Yeah.
I think about it. Obviously, there's a slippery slope fallacy that say if this happens, all the other things will happen. But I think that based on current evidence, it is kind of like rational to conclude that your body needs
It
a certain
is.
amount of food to be able to sustain and grow.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of self-correct a little bit because I did look through some old data while Kedric was talking because I made the claim that wrestlers are shorter. They're actually not, and this actually speaks to selection bias, like we talked about. Wrestlers are shorter on average probably because it's better to be a short wrestler.
Mm.
But what there is data showing that if you are, like, to Kedric's point, he specifically said chronic energy deprivation, and he pointed out North Korea versus South Korea, which I think is probably the best kind of natural experiment comparison. Um, the good news is that there is what is described as catch-up growth. So, like when you look at like dancers or people who had severe eating disorders in their youth, sometimes you'll see as like delayed maturation, delayed puberty. That once they actually develop a normal or better relationship with food and they eat sufficiently, you might see maturation and puberty occur later, and then you see what's called like catch-up growth. So that's good. That speaks to the resilience of the human body. But we have gone through periods where entire societies they never get that catch-up growth, right?
I was
Um,
gonna say, dog, I ain't catching up. I
yeah,
only got another 3 inch. This is where
yeah,
don't miss the boat, Junior. If you
Ryan,
listen to
yeah,
this, Junior subject.
yeah, Ryan, you might just be short. Like
Ah,
I
dog.
don't
Hey, I'm
think
5'9", you son of a bitch.
you might
That's
just be average.
yeah, okay. Thank you. That's okay. Thank you.
So yeah, I think that I just wanted to kind of correct the record there, but like it's always good to just mention how impressively resilient our bodies are, but it is important to mention that yeah, your body can only do the things you give it the energy and the building blocks for. And if you give it to it real late, it's going to be delayed. And by the time that happens, you might have been frustrated, burned out, and you've quit the sport after multiple injuries and just not getting as strong as you want. So yeah.
Okay, another thing we were talking about, maybe this goes hand in hand with what you guys were just saying. So, Kedrick, you were saying how when you're 74, injury prone, moved up to 83, and all of a sudden you don't even got to stretch, warm up, or whatever. You just get up underneath that bar. Obviously, Taylor Atwood, he was exact same, 74, injuries plaguing his career, looked like it was the end, moved up to 83. All of a sudden, my man is relatively healthy, or much more healthy when he's 74, smashing weights, making all types of big progress. And I'm wondering, you had said, like, if you cut calories, your hair's not growing, your fingernails aren't growing as much, you're eating plentiful, the hair's growing, the calories growing. And is this the same thing with all things, including, recovery? Your body can recover from workouts, recover because it's rejuvenating, just like small anecdotal indicators being hair growth, fingernail growth, etc. But also that be the same when it comes right down to other tissues in your body, the recovery and the rejuvenation of it. And when you're eating more healthy and your body's like, hey, I would actually prefer to be 83, thank you. So if you're going to be smashing weights, yes, your total is more competitive as a 74, but and the gain moving up a weight class won't be as crazy, but you are going to be far more less injury, less injuries. is this true? Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up from Eric Helms. Either one of you guys can go, by the way, or both.
I
Yeah,
think
this is go ahead.
yeah. So going back, first of all, in academic circles, we have problems like defining what injury is because of like it's sometimes it's like this circular definition, but we don't have to go into that. Because the whole idea of pain, right, is quite complex. Pain might not necessarily just be a structural thing, and if you look at like multiple studies where they actually look, like if everybody were to take an MRI now in powerlifters, a large population of that would have some kind of like disc bulge or stuff like that. But that doesn't mean that they are experiencing pain, right? So there are certain tissues that are supportive enough that still allows you to do the task functionally without pain. So for example, right, this is my personal example. Actually, just about a year ago, I tore my ACL, right, playing volleyball. And the typical test when people do to evaluate ACL tear is the anterior drawer test. So what they do is they put their hands, in front of your patella, and then they try to pull your tibia from behind. So because the ACL is in front, if your ACL is torn, what they do is you see a shift moving forward. Okay, so after the initial swelling, all right, I didn't feel any pain moving forward. Throughout the entire week, when I went to the physio and the orthopedic surgeon when they performed the anterior drawer test, they couldn't like my tibia wasn't moving, right? But after a scan, they actually showed that I have a complete like ACL tear. My ACL is like gone. It's not even like a partial tear. It's like fully torn.
Jesus.
And then what the orthopedic surgeon said is that your quadriceps muscles, because I've been squatting for years now, is so strong that it protects the surrounding structure, so that your tibia actually doesn't move. And I also don't feel any pain. And obviously I feel at the certain angles I feel like my knee is being loose, but until before my surgery I actually maxed out in the gym, right? I was like in my head I was like, okay, cool, I'm gonna do a surgery anyway. If I break anything, you're just gonna fix it. So I just max out in the gym, see how things go, and I could live fine, right? I had to modify my stance just for stability, but there wasn't any like pain. The reason why I bring this up is because pain can be so like multifactorial. It's actually quite hard to pinpoint to certain things. When it comes to Taylor, we also have to know that Taylor has a very, let's just say, a robust and full life outside powerlifting, right? It could just be the fact that like stress levels are high, you're chronically underfeeding yourself, and therefore your sensitivity to pain might just be very much heightened. I'm not saying that is the case, because I also don't want to paint the illusion that, oh, everybody move up your weight class, you will definitely get rid of all your injuries, because it's so like multifactorial. And to say that it is one thing, it is likely I don't have high levels of certainty to say that this will apply to everyone. But you can also say that if you get bigger and you have more tissues, right, the load on a specific area of a tissue is less. Therefore, that given the same amount of stimulus, the pain might be lower, right? And it could be just so many things. If you're chronically stressed, and with his two children, right, sleep is poor, and we know that poor sleep actually increase sensation of pain as well, right? And if you're having high sensitivity to pain, and you're in a calorie deficit, your body is at a higher stress state. The same stimulus you might feel it more. So I'm not saying that eating more fix all of Taylor's injuries, because that definitely isn't the case. And I know that for a fact because I worked closely with him up to today when he was a 74, going up to 83. Because if you think about it, right, back when Taylor totaled 800, was it 830 as a 74, right? Like he was a 74,
38.5.
right? Yeah, but he wasn't like experiencing like that chronic pain post that era. But lifestyle then for Taylor was also very different from the lifestyle he leads now, you know. So I'm not saying that is 100% the case that moving up a weight class fix all the injury. Obviously, my case as well is different. But I mean, even if I reach 110 and I don't die of obesity, I don't think I'll total 890 or something like that. So I think that while it is probably true in the case of Taylor that moving up a weight class helped him deal with his injuries better, there's like multiple layers to it and why that might be the case.
If you don't mind me stepping in, I think
Jump in.
it actually Kedrick talked through all the complexities of it, but actually, there's some really, really straightforward data on this. So you can diagnose relative energy deficiency in sport. There's some good position stands on it. This first came out in 2014 by Mountjoy, then 2018, and most recently in 2023. And the IOC and like the British Journal of Sports Medicine, they've developed some tools. Like they have a CAT2 tool of developing a gradation of how bad is your energy availability, like how poorly are you fueling compared to what you should be having. And when you grade them in like kind of like a traffic light system, like green, orange, red. When you have athletes in the orange and red compared to green in terms of their status of energy availability, you see fourfold higher risks of injury rate. So the occurrence of injury is, depending upon the study you're looking at, 4 to 8 times more likely in athletes across many sports, regardless of all the mechanisms and everything Kedrick just talked about. Like if you just watch them, you're 4 to 8 times as likely to be injured and 4 to 8 times as likely to have lower bone mineral density than if you're in the green light category. So
But
it's
people should not take that lightly when you're
no,
thinking about dropping.
absolutely. So yes, it is very difficult for us to say what is an injury and what is pain and all this stuff. And I totally agree that we need to take a broader lens at it. But however you define it, that thing is going to happen far more often when you're not fueled enough, and you are going to have the physiological markers which also predict injury, like lower bone mineral density, poorer cognitive performance, higher levels of fatigue. So some things it's very difficult to predict injury, but some things do reliably predict it. So, for example, in if you take someone in a fatigued state, so you do a fatigue test, and then you have them do a given motor learning task, you see greater movement variability. And you generally see higher injuries, for example, in the second half of games, right? So we have kind of observational data and then some mechanistic short-term data that indicates the more fatigued you are, the more likely you are to get hurt. And you increase fatigue when you're in a state of low energy availability because you're glycogen depleted. You have poor cognitive performance. You are potentially iron deficient, so you can't get as good of oxygen delivery. And then on top of that, when you are fatigued and you make one of these errors and you do something in general sport, this isn't powerlifting, but it does apply. Guess what? The actual tissues themselves have lower amounts of density in them. So there's lower bone mineral density, right? So you're exposing yourself to risk across many different patterns. And then the recovery itself, you see disrupted sleep. You see lower muscle protein synthesis rates, which is not just the ability to grow muscle, but also repair it. Muscle protein synthesis is acutely impacted by being in a state of energy deprivation. So one thing you will sometimes see anecdotally, and I haven't seen studies on this, but I would actually really love to do some research on it, is that delayed onset muscle soreness tends to last longer when you're not eating enough. You don't feel like the same amount of training feels like it beats you up more when you're in a deep diet. It's something that I've seen as a coach over time. And again, I'd love to get, a master's or a PhD student across this to see if it is impacted directly and if we control for it in the lab space. But nonetheless, we do have the data on that. We have these mechanistic short-term links. We see immune system suppression. We see muscle protein synthesis suppression. We see suppression of estrogen, testosterone, and knock-on effects on bone mineral density. And then when we just shelve that and we just look at associations, when we categorically look at athletes, okay, who is poorer fed and who's better fed? The ones who are poorer fed are consistently and in large scale analyses and in like meta analysis and systematic reviews where we collect all the studies on a topic, they're getting hurt multiple fold times more often in contact and in non contact sports, which I think is really important because there's probably cognitive and physiological components to that and fatigue. So, yeah, I don't think there's any question really that if you are someone who is cutting in the wrong way or trying to get too lean and stay too lean for too long, or in many cases doing both, you're taking a poor approach and you're trying to stay too lean for too long, especially during maturation, you are quantifiably and into a meaningful amount increasing your risk of injury.
Another thing I want to talk about, Kedrick, you were saying how to lose weight, you should do it slowly, but also to gain weight. To gain actual muscle mass that'll impact your performance, you need to do it slowly. And it's the same deal if somebody comes to you and they want to see gains if they're moving up. If they want to see significant gains, they should probably it's probably going to be over a longer stretch, a longer period of time. Like for instance, Taylor Atwood moving up to the 83s. Initially, I think he hit 830, had a lot of room to spare. But even if you pegged him at around 850 something on that day, by the time Nationals rolls around, he hit 876 and did a bit of a YOLO last third lift, and if he had not did a yellow last third lift, he'd be in the probably 880s. So over time, a little more time is an 83 because he's adding more and more and more muscle mass, which comes on slower. And you can't just rapidly increase that by eating more. That's not the way it works. It's not a steroid, it's only food. So it took him a while to put that muscle mass on. And then we saw his total move up. So his total got a bump due to being more healthy, and then got a bigger bump further down the road as more time as an 83. And we can anticipate even more so because he's, again, more and more muscle mass. He's spending more and more time eating as an 83, lifting weights, etc. So that's Taylor Atwood, the slower approach. That brings me to his teammate on Team USA at the North American Championships, which is just about to go down, Russ Orhii, moving up to 93. But this move to 93 was relatively quickly. If you remember, he was initially going to go to the World Games competition and as an 83, no less. And I think it's only been a couple of months that he decided I'm going to go 93. And while he's shifting big weight, I got to think his best 93 kilo performances are yet to come about, either the end of 2025 or maybe even American Nationals when he battles the other American 93s. His total, it no matter what, people are going to look at his performance at the North American Championships and judge him on that. And they're going to get ahead of themselves and start talking like, well, if he doesn't break the world record 93, yeah, okay. Bad move moving up. That's where he's going to be. I'll see you at American Nationals. You're going to get killed. And if we're paying attention to the science, what you guys are saying, paying attention to anecdotal evidence like Taylor Atwood, it's going to take more time. That's what I was saying is if he breaks the world record at North Americans, oh my gosh. Well, first off, what does that say in terms of his struggles to make 83 when only how quickly he develops as a 93? And then what does that say for the future where he might be when he continues at 93, continues eating where he's eating and clearly putting on muscle? What would you say? What do you anticipate from the North American showing? I'm going to throw this to both you gentlemen. The North American showing of Russell Orhii, what does it say if all of a sudden he breaks the 93 kilo world record? No, he could not have put on all of that muscle in 2 months. So how the heck does that happen? And then what are we looking at? If we look for what we see at North Americans, what can we anticipate by the time US Nationals rolls around? Is it going to be like a Taylor Atwood where it's like, okay, you saw him at 83 at Scary Strong at the end of 2024? That is probably nothing compared to what's coming. You're going to have major issues by the time American Nationals rolls around. And yeah, we're gonna find out what Taylor does at North Americans as well. Interesting. Both these gentlemen moving up for North Americans. Very interesting. We're going to glean a lot of data from that. But let's talk about it, fellas. Who wants to jump in first about the Russell Orhii experiment?
Go for it, Kedric.
Yeah, I think I can comment a little about what about this. Of course, everything uh, depends on what Russ would hit, you know. So if I were to look at what makes sense for him to hit, would be just probably at the world record or just slightly above it. Because the reason to do this is potentially to get a Sheffield wild card, right? So, and if you want to go to Sheffield, you probably want to place high. So you probably don't want to like do something too, you know, that makes it harder for yourself, moving forward, right? So that's one. So if we use that number, which is roughly 920, and I think that Russ Russ's best total prior was around 885, right? Which is at roughly 90 kilos. Okay. If I'm not mistaken, the one where he did in Korea. So
Correct.
if you take like 920, right? Of course it can be more, and you take 885, that's roughly around 4.2% increase in a total, right? Uh, from his best ever total. And if we look at Taylor, right? Taylor's goal obviously is to also break the world record. So we are just essentially looking at certain targets that they plan to hit and assuming that they do hit that, right? And prior to Taylor moving up the weight class, his best total as a 74 was around like what 838 or something, right? And if you take like
840-ish, yeah.
Yeah, this 890
38.5.
8 divide 838, that's roughly 6.2%. So it's a 2% more than Russ. And the reason why I bring up this comparison is because having managed Taylor's nutrition since 2018, right? For the past 7 years, basically since I started doing that survey until now, Taylor has never struggled to make weight as a 74. So he has always been a relatively light 74, and his decision to move up was not because he struggled to make weight. Whereas Russ, speaking to Joey, and I'm sure Russ has talked about it as well. Russ has to sauna, right? And you usually on the hierarchy of weight making strategies, any form of dehydration with heat exposure would usually be the last thing that you want to do when all else has already been done. That probably tells you that Russ's starting weight is much higher than usual. So it wouldn't be too much of a surprise that if both of them move up the weight class, the person that sits generally heavier stands to gain slightly less compared to the person who sits lighter. Because if you think about Taylor, let's just say he's 70. I think that the heaviest I've seen Taylor as a 74 was maybe on a day where he had pizza, he was like 77. That's 3 kilos above the weight class, right? Russ was like close to 90 kilos at the Korea competition. That's almost 7 kilos above the weight class. That's almost a whole 10% above the weight class, right? So you can look at that starting point and just see like potentially Taylor has gained slightly more, to put it in a quote unquote term, functional tissue. When I say functional, I also mean functional for the sport of powerlifting, not functional in terms of like any other aspects. Whereas Russ probably still needs some time, right? Because like I said, the turnaround is quite quick. So I would probably say that, I mean, all of this can change depending on what they end up hitting, because we know that hitting a number on the platform is very different from actually measuring what their strength is. So we can only use certain like surrogates to say, because Russ might hit 920 and he might hold there, but people say, oh, he had 930, he had 940, right? But for Russ to make the same amount of percentage increase as Taylor, assuming that Taylor also breaks the world record, Russ has to hit like close to 940 on the day, and even if he is capable, I'm not sure if he would do that, because if he were to get a wild card to go to Sheffield, like cool, the total is like 940 now, so what
Bad
like
idea.
would you make like X amount of gains within this period of time? So I don't really know, but based on just the change in weight from their highest point, Taylor definitely has benefited slightly more just from the amount of functional tissue he has gained. So that's kind of like my brief thoughts from the outside perspective, because like I said, I don't think anybody here on this panel would know what Russ is doing. Sorry, what Russ's weight is, what has its eating been like. But I am speaking with some information in relation to Taylor. So yeah, take that whatever I said with that context in mind.
Yeah. And I'll provide people kind of some context on what generally impacts how much someone gains when they go up a weight class. And I have a lot of experience with this because I have coached Bryce over time, who is kind of the opposite success story. He was very good, but placing kind of around fifth as a 93 at USAPL Nats back in the day when that was the IPF affiliate, to then becoming a world champion, silver medalist, and four-time national champion when we moved up to 105. And he had a disproportionate spurt in growth and competitiveness when he went from 93 to 105. And there's two things that impact what going up will likely do to benefit your performance. And you can get glimpses of this if you look at someone is how much does their training total go down relative to their competition total in a short time period. This tells you about what they're losing just from the acute process of weight cutting in the final weeks, right? Like how drastic does their rapid weight loss need to be and how much is that impacting their platform total? But then the other component is more what Kedric was talking about is how much were they being quote unquote held back from filling out their true growth potential if they have time to go up a weight class. And when both of those things converge, when you've been not in your ideal weight class and what you do to have to be in your not ideal weight class, not just long-term suppressing strength kind of generally, but acutely dropping your strength because what you need to do on like the week or even the last 2 days of competition are holding you back. That's when you see these big leaps. So I think that that competition at 90 kilos is quite telling about Russ, and kind of seeing where his best numbers are at relative to being on the platform. It tells you something as well. And Taylor's a great example of kind of only being impacted by one of these, but that's still having a big impact. He was maybe about as muscular as he could be at a 74, and he was, the second best 74 of all time, and by far the best in his era by a long shot. But man, he has gotten quite strong as an 83, and that's pretty cool. So when you layer those two things together, you can see some pretty surprising performances out of someone. And it can happen in a relatively short period of time if you were just staying a little too lean and you're kind of holding back your growth potential. Kind of like I was talking about earlier, how there's some data, how like you might go through puberty late if you're wrestling in high school, and you might get a growth spurt, when you're 19 and you're putting on your freshman 15, and everyone else's freshman 15 might be a little sloppy, and you just look like you turned into more of a man. You're like, oh shit, that worked out. What was the change? You stop weight cycling for half the year. Okay, cool. Those things seem to happen. I've seen them in bodybuilding and powerlifting. I've worked with some people who got into physique sport too early and they're constantly dieting and they finally have like an extended off season. They step away from competing for multiple years and they make this monumental fast leap in performance. And people are like, oh, are they on gear? It's like, no, they're just not chronically dieting anymore. So that can sometimes happen rapidly. It seems like the body is just like, man, if you just feed me all this training you're doing, I could put on some muscle. But you're hovering around this weight class and like your body is just ready to soak up nutrients and build muscle. Berto and we worked with some very high level lifters on their nutrition. I won't share any names, but he's worked with some athletes who it's like I actually have to be careful about them putting on muscle mass too quickly because their body just does not want to be this weight class. And as soon as they start feeding and they feel better, they train better, all of a sudden, like you can see them not just putting on fat mass, but also muscle mass in concert with it. And it's like, oh, they can be an 83, but should they be? And that may be what we see with Russ. So I'm quite interested, but there is still a time component. Even though you can put on muscle mass faster when you've been kind of quote unquote holding yourself back, it's not magic. So there is certainly a time component, and you do need to grow into a weight class.
And I got a follow-up question for you guys, but there'll be an initial bump because for context, when he did 885, before that, obviously his previous 83 kilo numbers hovering in the 840s, early 840s, quickly threw on over 40 kilos onto his total within a couple months, real quick. And in that South Korea performance, obviously traveled to the other side of the world. Massive travel, time zone change, circadian rhythms, it exists. And all of those negative impacts still threw on over 40 kilos. And I remember Pete Spence sharing a stat a little ways back about performances dropping it was worlds. But so there's the world standard caveat and challenges, but also how travel can probably impact you negatively as well. So I'm interested in that bump. So if Russ is now from Sheffield in the 870s, and we suspect again, if it was just a max out and we dropped his deadlift a little bit because that last deadlift just came out of his hands. So we lowered that last attempt and really got a max out. He's allowed a fourth deadlift and we let him go. Or we just redid his third if he's around 880. Ooh, yeah. Now we are talking around 920 range, aren't we? Maybe. Maybe. And to your guys' point, take him to US Nationals, let him build upon. Maybe we're looking at 930, 940, 935. I don't know. We'll find out. Let me ask you guys right now, $1 million on the table for each of you. I need to
Mm.
know. First, we'll go with Eric Helms. Does Russell Orhii break the 93 kilo world record at NAPS?
I'm going to say, yeah. I say he chips it.
Kedric,
I would say that I'll just say no, just to balance the scale.
pun,
And
nice pun in there. On the weight cutting episode. And Eric, because I already know Kedric's going to answer. Does Taylor Atwood break the 83 kilo world record, which is a reminder to you 900 kilos was done at the national level by Joe B. The world record's actually 890. So that means Taylor needs 890.5. And another reminder, he did 876 and ended up throwing away his third dead. We're all sure he's on the 880s in April. So he needs roughly 5, maybe 7.5 kilos onto his total from April to late July. Um, so having said that, Taylor Atwood, does he break the world record?
I'm also going to say yes.
And Kedric, in the interest of balancing the scales, will put you down as you think Taylor will not. Thank you. Taylor's going to be shocked to hear that. Here's another one.
No
Hannah,
chance to respond. I love
no
it.
chance to respond. Exactly. Not my first rodeo, Playboy. Penna is talking about after World Games moving up to 74 kilos. And he's coining this one as last dance. Now, Penna, we've seen obviously a extremely successful 66, but haven't seen the growth on his. We've seen a growth on his total, but not the growth on his total that, for instance, Russell saw an immediate 40 kilos when he jumped up, or Taylor, again, phenomenal 74, moved up to 83. Holy smokes. Look what he's been doing. And we've seen Penna with flashes of a potential super total if you take his gym lifts. And people would say, well, he's not a platform performer. All right. If you want to talk attempt selection, whatever. But I would pose to you, what if this weight cut, water cut, etc., is impacting him more than he thinks? He is extremely diced. A lot of these, I don't know if the symptoms is the word you guys have said earlier about when you're so lean and how it may impact you. And if he was to fill out 74, not just be a small 74, not just make 74, but actually coming around 77, which is 15 pounds more than we're used to seeing him in the gym. And we know what his gym totals are like. He had 15 pounds, and I think he could fill 15 pounds just like Russ, just like Taylor, pretty quickly. He's still in his 20s. He's incredibly diced. Can you imagine a 77 kilo Penna cutting 3 kilos of water, which is nothing for him? That's less than what he cuts at a 66. Percentage wise, that's a joke cut for him. Can you imagine what he might do? What are your guys' thoughts on Penna moving to 74? What might you anticipate? Eric, ever the gentleman.
um, I do think that how lifters, and this is not me trying to psychologize any of the lifters, but I'm just looking at it from a perspective of what what can they gain versus what they can they would lose, right? Yeah. Uh, Besides body weight, obviously, pun not intended. But when we now with Chell moving back up to the 74, uh, initially a lot of lifters say that okay, cool, I want to move to the 74 because there's only like perk, right? Only perk is above 800, and if you look at uh what the world's is on third place this year was like sub 750, right? Around that range. And for a 66 lifter to go past that range, it is quite doable, right? When you put on some weight. But now you have Chell going back up, right? And then you have the Russian, right? And all of them already total 800, right? So if the goal of uh this lifters, right, whether it's Pana or Kyoto, right, is to podium at Worlds, uh, because I do think that regardless, Sheffield might be out of the cards for them, depending on what perk hits. If a perk hits 870, cool. You're not going to go to Sheffield with a wild card because you need a total of like 830 or something, right? And the 66 world record is like 770 ish, right? So I think Sheffield for now is out of the card. But if the goal is to podium at Worlds, would they start to reevaluate and be like, now that Kyoda's going up, and essentially it's like game theory, right? Which lifter decides to commit to the 74 and which lifter wants to stay at the 66 class to podium at Worlds again. Because I think that podiuming at Worlds is probably better than getting like 6, 7 place in the next weight class up. And that is short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. So I don't really know. I can't really speak to uh, the psychology of these lifters. And you also have to keep in mind that Pana and Kyoto, both of them announced that they were moving up, also did not compete at Worlds this year. And I'm not sure if them coming back to Worlds next year and becoming like 8th place would be something that they would want, you know. So those are just things I think about. For I might be just completely talking nonsense, and Pana might move up. And if I were to say, if you were to really fill up the class, I could probably say that within a year or two, Pana could total 800. And that's, if I were a betting man, that's what I would roughly bet at. So
Okay, so you answered a few questions for me, and thank you. I was going to say, what do you think he'd land at? I'm going to throw it to Eric Helms. You made some interesting points. Joe Jordan was just on the podcast. He said, I wonder where Pena will land on this, given Shell has moved, Kasim Sands moved down. However, Daniel Clements is reemerging. Avery Jackson has emerged. He's already hit 720. Total dropped a little at Worlds, but I'm anticipating it's only going to go up. Next time you see him at Worlds might be 740. Joe Jordan's getting stronger. So what do you think, Eric? What do you anticipate to see out of Penna when he moves up? Are you thinking around an 800 kilo total? And what a shame it'd be if he retires never having seen 800 when it's potentially his. That's a hell of a milestone and a feather in his cap. And what do you think he actually will do?
That's a tough one. Only Penna knows what he actually will do. Um, and this is someone who I consider a friend, and he's been on the podcast, so I don't want to speculate when he could speak to it. But I will say that I think he's a good candidate for moving up, and I will say this. I agree that it would be a shame if you don't find out what your potential is when you try going up. And I think getting too wrapped up in where do I have the best chance to do well at Worlds is and actually it sounds like a winner strategy, but I think it's kind of a losing strategy at this stage because certain things just aren't on the table, and you can't necessarily bet something that big on unknowns and the predictability of what other competitors would do. I hope he just commits to going up because I think he's a good candidate for someone who would get a big bump in his total from going up based upon what we've seen. I could be wrong. Maybe he is naturally lean and he's like, oh man, I have to crush myself just to get up to 73, let alone what you were saying, Ryan, at 77, then cutting down. But I think we've seen that even just maybe him at 70 could probably put together what we would consider a super total of his current lifts and maybe be around like maybe 740. And then you think about, is there some muscle gain and weighting with enough time, I do think he could probably put up close to 800 with time in the weight class and moving up. And it just takes a little bit of patience, but I know it's hard. You know, when you're used to being a multi-time world champion, can you stomach being average in the next weight class in service of getting to the point where you are actually quite good? Um, and that's a tough thing, you know? Um, Many times I don't envy high level lifters because they don't necessarily have the perspective of what it's like just to be your average power lifter. Or, you know, you are competing to place 20th at your regional competition and maybe one day get a national title. And I talk to powerlifters sometimes, they can't even fathom, like, they don't relate to why powerlifters do it at a lower level because they've always been gifted enough to compete at a high level. And they're actually missing out on some of the most powerful motivations, the intrinsic motivation for doing it because you love it, not because you're competing, because that's always been on the cards for them. You know, at a high level, you've always been within a hope and a dream and a self-motivating story of being a world champion or qualifying for worlds or being a European champion. And that kind of delays your maturity in the sport sometimes if that comes early. You don't get the opportunity to have a deeper reason, a more personal reason that's not extrinsic for competing. And you're also visible. It's not just internally going on. It's like, damn it, people know me as a world champion. I don't want to place
Mm.
eighth or ninth or 10th. I'm going to get judged. People are going to talk bad about me. I don't get to have a personal journey because I'm a public figure. So this private experience that I would love to have and develop for the love of the game, it's somewhat robbed by what people might say on social media. So it takes managing your exposure to the public, you know, curating your feed in the modern social media era, asking yourself hard questions, looking inward, and going, what's going to make me feel satisfied if I look back on my career? And I can say with probability, having worked with people all the way from the first meet all the way to retirement, is that I suspect you'd feel more satisfied with not having to ask that question of what would have happened if I moved up, rather than making a decision that ultimately I think is kind of fear-based. When you really think about it, oh, let me not go up because I want to make sure I'm still kind of competitive and I'm not embarrassed. Even though it feels like the champion's mindset, I want to go where I'm most competitive. It's not really that. I think it's kind of that masquerading.
What an excellent way to put position that. Don't make a fear-based decision. More likely later in life, you'll be upset and regret a fear-based decision. And if for Penna, and I would get it, or for anybody, I would get it if they felt like, frig, I have all this pressure to perform at the top end. What if I don't podium? And to an extent, it's almost like, but you've already proven yourself. You've won multiple world championships, broken world records, been to Sheffield. You look back, it's already done. The dream,
Hmm.
everyone says, I want to be a world champ. You've done it twice over. Now's the time you could live for self. And you know, all of its followers and whatnot, you're going to have two-time world champion in your bio regardless. Get as big and strong as jacked as possible, smash some weights, and let's see what happens. And if you
That's the
ever want to,
perspective, Ryan.
if you ever want to be 35 like Shell and cut back down and say, what the heck happens if I cut down? Give it a season like Shell did if you really need to. But I got a feeling you might not. I got a feeling, but you'll never know unless you peep around that door. You'll never know unless you peep around that corner. I think on that, we put a pin in it. We've hit 3 hours. You gentlemen did an absolutely phenomenal job. 3 fucking hours. Oh my gosh. It is what it is. And we didn't even get through like protocols to use, etc. We just started hovering around good conversation points, but it is what it is. That's the way we go. So, gentlemen, thank you for coming on the podcast once again. From the bottom of my heart, we have to do another one of these. There's a billion different topics we could use, different guests we could pull in. So let's jump into our little group chat and we'll sort some out. And for everybody listening, as per usual, please do subscribe, give us high ratings, and until next time, six pack Lapadat, six up, and we are out.